Before his eyes was a real battlefield. Unknown monsters and other creatures were advancing. The fighter was already exhausted. He couldn't understand when it would end, and how many more would have to die for this phase to end. He couldn't understand what was happening around him. Who were these people nearby? How much longer could he hold out? Looking at the monster, which looked more like a huge monster, he realized more and more that he couldn't predict its next move. He started yelling at the others that they couldn't just die here like that. He asked everyone who had survived to use the portal and run. The warriors standing next to him refused, saying that was out of the question. If they left, they would put all the villagers in danger. One of the men added that it was not yet time to give up completely. He believed that they still had a chance of victory. He called the main leader the captain, and then they saw something completely new on the horizon. They all began to look toward the source of the light. The dragon grew more and more heated and roared before attacking. But people emerged from the light. Their silhouettes were already visible. The captain realized that the first planning group's troops had arrived. They were here. And when he looked at their leader in his beautiful full combat uniform, he was simply stunned. The leader ordered his team to follow him forward. The battle began. He looked like a determined and confident warrior. After just 30 seconds of battle, the first phase was completely cleared. Another minute and 45 seconds later, they cleared the second phase. Their strength, experience, and power were unmatched. 4 minutes and 18 seconds after the start of the battle, the third phase was also cleared. And then, the boss's transformation phase began. All the warriors, including those who had arrived from the first planning group, were stunned by what they saw. The hero looked straight into the monster's face and thought only that he was ready to accept his punishment. The notification system announced to the players that Khan was activating Berserk. The dragon began to glow from within, its mouth open. A warrior from the first planning group stepped forward, leaving ruins of stones behind him. He shouted that everyone should step back. Only Tanker was to engage in combat. The notification system announced that the user had used a skill in the game. And then the dragon began to spew a huge blue stream of energy from its enormous mouth, like Sisyphus endlessly rolling a boulder to the very top of the mountain. After a while, the alert sounded again, announcing that the first real casualties had appeared among the allied army. A warrior from the first planning group jumped forward with his sword in his hands, straight at the dragon, which was attacking one of his group members at that moment. He used his new sword enhancement skill, and the user notification system gave the go-ahead. He raised his sword, which was shrouded in the power of the Savior's wrath, and dealt a devastating blow to the dragon. The boss roared in pain, and from the force of the blow, and traces of damage began to appear on his head. However, this was still not enough to defeat him. The warrior understood that no matter how much he fought the monsters in the game, they would not end, and that he himself had created them. In the evening of the same day, everything was different. He was in his office with his colleague, and they were discussing the release of a new game. He asked them to make adjustments to the boss's characteristics before launch. His department head and assistants sat and looked at him a little skeptically. The director asked if it was worth doing at all. One of the group also said that he was concerned about the status of the bosses in the game. Without making purchases within the game, it would be almost impossible to defeat them. Another man supported this, adding that it would most likely lead to users immediately quitting the game upon learning about it. The game's chief creator just sighed and told the boss that the game, called New Fantasy, had been in development for many years. The boss smiled and said that there had been no release for about 5 years. He said that it would be released soon, and that they didn't have to bear all the costs for all this time. He added that the neighboring team in the game was living too lavishly, as their project had been successful for over 2 years. He asked if no one noticed this, and said that they should focus on what was really important right now. He started yelling at everyone that game users spend money when they simply lack something. This applied to skills or weapons. The guy started asking his team if they had joined the company not for self-fulfillment and to achieve higher goals. He looked at them and motivated them in every way possible, saying that it was time to pull themselves together. His boss said it was time to call it a day. He asked the planning team leader to stay behind after the meeting for a moment. Everyone left the office and went home. The managers sat across from each other, and the company director turned to So-Sa-Hyuk with a serious look on his face. He said that the way he spoke to his subordinates was unacceptable, and that the future director could not say such things to them. He was angry with him. So Sahuk replied that there was nothing he could do about it, because nothing got through to these idiots in a nice way. He had to repeat everything to them. The manager replied that this was the problem. Not everyone's brain works according to the same algorithm as Sosa-Heku's. All people and subordinates are different. He asked if he remembered how many times their project had almost failed. The development cycle was too long. So Saheku replied that the neighboring team had started working on the game much later than them, and now they were paying their team's salaries. He asked the director if he had noticed how the boss's expression changed when he looked at the manager. It was not an easy question. Saheku stood up and said that he was not the only one who wanted to succeed. He promised the director that he would soon see how he would breathe life into the project. The director listened silently and looked at some papers with the expenditure part. Then he suddenly asked Saheku to imagine that he was playing the game himself. He added that if the director himself were inside the game or played it personally, he would understand that it should not be like that. So Saheku replied that even a popular gambling game in Japan, such as pachinko, was also roughly the same. After talking with the director, Saheku returned to his work. He didn't even remember how long he had been sitting there. Liters of coffee and cola stood on his desk. Then a young girl's face appeared from behind his computer. She called Mr. Heku by name and smiled. So Saheku looked at her with a dissatisfied tone and asked what she wanted. She reminded him that she had heard him promise to pick up his daughter today. And then it dawned on him. He had really forgotten about his haru because of work. It was already quite late. With a sigh, he took out his cell phone and started looking through all his missed messages and calls. He received several messages from the Sunshine Kindergarten, where his daughter was, saying that Haru was refusing to go home again. Her uncle ended up picking her up, but the girl was crying a lot. They asked him to pick her up himself. However, because of the meeting, he had only just seen this. So Sahyuk knew that Juhyuk had probably already picked up his daughter from the kindergarten, so he decided to call him and clarify everything. Juhyuk answered the call fairly quickly. He said that it was no problem for him to pick up Haru from the kindergarten. He added that he thought Sahyuk was busy, so he went to pick her up. The girl was crying. He said that she had been asking about her father and had thrown a tantrum there. However, she was now tired and sleeping soundly, so Sahyuk didn't need to worry anymore. They ended the conversation, and Sahyuk thanked Juhyuk, hung up the phone, and sat down exhausted in his office chair. He was exhausted. Looking at a photo of himself and his wife, he suddenly realized that this was what he had thought all along. He couldn't handle everything on his own without her. The girl returned to his computer and reminded him that it was almost 10 o'clock. And that it was time for the manager to finish work and go home. She herself thought that she would also like to finally leave. However, Sahyuk replied that he couldn't do that yet, and that he was staying. He had to make some more adjustments before tomorrow. He also wanted to go home, but he couldn't afford to be so careless. The launch of the game New Fantasy was imminent, and he had to finish everything. The girl replied that he had been working overtime here for 3 months and had not had any rest. She added that he should spend time with his daughter today. However, Saheku replied that he wanted to raise his daughter so that she would not want for anything. That was his main goal, and he let his assistant go and stayed at the office to work. After a while, he returned to the kitchen to make coffee. Saheku couldn't even remember how many cups he had, and just stood there thinking about his boss's words. His boss kept telling him that the game shouldn't be like that. Everyone thought it was too complicated, especially with the key bosses in the game. So Saheku himself understood that they were doing something wrong, and that many adjustments and corrections needed to be made before the release. However, he knew for sure that the process of creating a successful game should not stop. He decided to return to his workplace as soon as possible. So Saheku was stressed and very tired and exhausted. He was ready to work and, if necessary, take responsibility for the failure. He understood that the philosophy of the game was something that people talked about when they went to school or competition, or something that friends argued about among themselves. However, he did not know if this game could provide him and his daughter with money. Everyone romanticized this project so much that it made him sick. He considered it nonsense. So Sahyuk drank coffee in the kitchen and thought about how, no matter what, he and his boss could not understand each other. He decided what he had to do. Someday, after success, everyone would still say thank you and be grateful for the work he had done. And then, something suddenly changed around him. Lightning and sparks lit up in his eyes. His head was not thinking clearly, and so Sahyuk decided that it was all due to fatigue and caffeine. He moved toward his office from the kitchen, but realized that his body refused to obey him. He was swaying from side to side, so Saheku could hardly see anything in front of him, and, losing consciousness, dropped his coffee cup on the floor. He didn't know how long he was out of it. His hearing slowly returned, and he realized that it was too loud around him. So Saheku decided that he had fallen asleep right at work. Getting to his feet but still not understanding what was going on around him, he decided it was time to quit caffeine. And then he opened his eyes and raised his head. Bright light hit his eyes, and the scene before him shocked him. He didn't understand where he was. There were some unfamiliar people standing nearby. And then he looked at his hands and saw strange clothes and gloves on his hands. Then the announcement system came on and welcomed all the participants to the testing ground, saying they were ready to see their talents. The system said that the participants would be able to gain new skills and strength here. Saheku stood there, shocked by what he saw and heard. He looked at the monitor, and then, after a couple of minutes, a huge, dragon-like monster began to loom over all the participants. It was a certain Toisagak. The man began to ask a certain captain why this monster was so resilient. He said that if they didn't defeat it this time, it would be a failure. The monster was hardly tired, and they would not be able to get their class. For some, this was already their third attempt. They called the captain Mr. a so and asked for help. The red-haired guy smiled and replied that they should not give up, because soon they would all defeat it and find a way to win. He paused. They all saw Sosaheku rush straight at Troisagak with a sword in his hand. They didn't understand why that guy was attacking the monster alone. Everyone started yelling at him that he was crazy and should stop. They believed that even with their combined efforts, it would be difficult to defeat this boss. So Saheku rushed forward, deciding that catching the monster would be a piece of cake. He had created it himself, so he was well aware of its fighting tactics. The transition exam was the very first stage of training in the game New Fantasy. He explained the importance of role-playing. If the tanker attracted the boss's attention, the dealer would be able to destroy the simple crystal system located on the monster's back. Saheku decided to attack. He saw that the monster had turned its attention to the other participants, and he had a chance. He swung his sword and struck the monster's back. However, things turned out a little differently than he had expected. So Saheku didn't understand what had happened. Someone had put up a shield in front of him. Then, the captain's voice asked him why he was rushing ahead alone. He wanted to say that there were rules for the class change exam. After all, they had to deal with the boss together. However, Saheku didn't let him finish, and started yelling at him to get out of the way. The captain said that he shouldn't be stubborn, and that they still had to take care of the wounded. So Saheku yelled at him that he was wasting time pushing him. The captain wouldn't let him go. Meanwhile, the monster was getting closer and closer to the two of them. So Saheku decided that he couldn't delay any longer, and kicked the captain hard in the back. The captain jumped aside and fell to the ground from the blow. Lying on the ground, he angrily asked Saheku what he was doing and where he had come from. Saheku just ran away in the other direction and shouted at him to hold his shield and distract Toisagaka. The captain replied that the guy was just a madman, but he deflected the beast's attacks with his shield as best he could. He reminded him that the monster did not respond to physical attacks. These words made Saheku, who was running with a sword in his hands. He remembered that the captain was actually right. He realized that all this time, they had been using the wrong tactics to win. So Saheku raised his sword. He swung and struck the monster. The blow landed directly on the crystals on its back. Toisagak began to lose its life force. All participants, including the captain himself, noticed on the game's notification system that the monster's health had decreased after the blow. So, Saheku continued to strike Toisagak's back, reducing its strength. At some point, the beast fell to the ground and closed its eyes. It was unconscious. The captain stood with his mouth open in surprise. He did not expect this unfamiliar guy to be able to stun the beast. He did not know the correct tactics for attacking. He did not know that in order to defeat Taisagaka, he had to destroy the crystals on his back. Seeing that the monster was barely moving and unconscious, Saheku stood with his weapon in his hands and, having caught his breath, wanted to deliver the final blow. He decided that as soon as he finally defeated this monster, his dream would end and he would be able to return home. He swung his sword. However, immediately after the attack, he realized that his sword had simply bounced off the last crystal on Toisagaka's back. So Saheku didn't understand why this happened, and began to remember the days when they were developing the game. It was he who had suggested this move back then. Even during training, the boss's skills should be used, and when only one crystal remains, the real fun begins for the participants. So Saheku decided that this dream was too similar to the game he had invented, and was shocked by it. He didn't understand what he was thinking at the time. After all, defeating Toisagaka was not easy now. So Saheku sighed, and decided that there was nothing left to do but what he had come up with himself. Then a captain named Aso started shouting something at him. He decided that they should defeat the monster together. So Saheku asked if the others were his subordinates. The guys stood aside and waited to see what would happen next. So Saheku ordered Aso to tell them to take the central position. However, the captain did not want to obey, and asked Saheku to give him at least one reason why this should be done. After all, he did not know the right tactics. So Saheku asked if he had not seen how much damage he had caused to the monster, and began to shout that he should be obeyed. He was dissatisfied with the captain. So Saheku wanted to get this over with as soon as possible and asked the captain what the problem was with doing as he told them all to do. Aso looked at him thoughtfully and silently. Then he immediately ordered the participants of the transition exam to listen to his instructions. They stood silently, and so Saheku decided that they would stop arguing after seeing how he had dealt with Taisagak alone. However, he was wrong, as Captain Aso ordered everyone to move away from the center and run to the sides. He thought it was dangerous, so Saheku decided that he had misheard. However, he realized that Aso was ordering everyone to spread out and leave the center. Everything was not going according to plan. Aso said that the guy was willing to risk the lives of his teammates and that they couldn't trust him. He was talking about So Saheku. He started yelling at them that they had seen him attack the monster and defeat it. So Sahyuk tried to advise them to gather in the center. The guys looked at the two of them and didn't know who to listen to in the end. After all, both were saying different things. One of them agreed with Aso. He told the others that the captain was the most promising adventurer among the aristocrats, while the other guy had no manners. Aso ran ahead, shouting to everyone that they still had time and needed to prepare again to launch a new attack on Taisagaka. So Saheku was angry at everyone. He had planned to deal with the boss as soon as possible, but now his plans had been changed by the participants in the battle. His goal of escaping from this dream was shattered. He thought to himself that if he was left alone with the monster, he would have only one option. This thought made him break out in a cold sweat. Only he understood what he would have to do. The monster immediately woke up and looked straight at him. So Haiku stood nearby with a sword in his hand, realizing that this was it. He was completely ambushed. And then, in a second, Taisagak growled and began to open his huge fanged mouth loudly. And the others heard these sounds, and turning around, the captain asked the others what it was. And then they saw the legs of that very stranger appear in Taisagak's still open mouth. He had swallowed him. Then the warning system announced that Taisagak was using his skill called armor spin. The ground beneath their feet began to crack. Everyone ran away from the monster, knowing what was about to happen. One of the guys was completely terrified and started screaming for help. Then everyone saw Captain Aso turn toward the beast and raise his shield again. No one understood what he was thinking. He thought to himself that it was worth trying the tactic that Sosaheku had told him about and taking the central position. He thought that Sosaheku was deceiving them. He decided to sacrifice all the participants for his own goals, to complete the exam alone, so to speak. Holding his shield, Captain Aso shouted that even if his own body was torn to pieces, he would never betray his comrades in arms. Then the monster recoiled slightly and stopped using its armor spin technique. Everything began to change. It roared. Aso couldn't understand what had happened and where these changes in the monster's behavior had come from. Then he looked closely. He realized that someone inside Toisagaka was wielding a weapon, inflicting damage on it. A couple of minutes later, the monster's body was torn to pieces, and soon Sosaheku himself appeared before the captain. It was amazing. The guy had defeated the boss from inside its body after being swallowed. Sosaheku looked angry. He was so enraged that he had to feel all the monster's insides on his body. He remembered his days at work and a conversation with a colleague. The colleague asked how to defeat Toisagaka as a single user. He replied that he would come up with a way to defeat the monster without outside help. He decided that if the monster ate the player would end up in its stomach and destroy its crystals from the inside. His colleague was a little skeptical. He said that the sight of organs might disgust some people. However, Sosaheku replied that it was just a game, and there was nothing wrong with that. And now, standing in gastric juice, Sosaheku knew how seriously he had been mistaken back then. One of the guys shouted enthusiastically that Aso had succeeded and that he was a real hero. He even saved the guy who was swallowed by Toisagak. It's amazing. Aso was a little embarrassed and wanted to object, but he didn't. After all, he himself didn't really understand what had happened. So Saheku stood there and tried to clean himself up a little from the stomach mucus. Aso looked at him and couldn't understand who this guy was and how he knew about Toisagak. So Saheku still wanted to believe that he was asleep and that he would now level up in the game and wake up. The whole group of players, along with their captain, also knelt down at the class acquisition site. So Saheku just wanted to finish everything quickly so he could go home. He thought that since he had saved everyone and defeated the boss, he would receive a class to match, something like a paladin or a crusader. Finally, the winner was announced, and it was Aso, who was assigned the class of paladin. So Saheku was outraged and dissatisfied with this decision. Why was Aso given such a high class? But suddenly, he felt something, as if thousands of needles inside him had begun to move. He rejoiced, feeling his body fill with new energy. He expected that his power would match the class he had been assigned. The feeling was like awakening. His thoughts bubbled with joy that he had been assigned a high class after all. Then he saw the name of the class he had been assigned on the board, Novice Knight. It was not at all what he had expected. He was angry at the system. After all, he had come up with all this and defeated Toi Sagaka. Why did he get such a worthless class that he had not developed in his game? The next moment, he saw a chest with a rusty sword open before his eyes. It was a first-level weapon in the game. He decided that this must be some kind of prolonged joke. This sword was already in his hands, but its creation had not been given the attention it deserved. Its durability was questionable. No one knew when it would become unusable. So Saheku went mad and tried to convince himself to wake up immediately. He was thoroughly fed up with it. Suddenly, a cloud or whirlwind swirled in front of him, turning into a notification window. A voice came from it, addressed to Saheku, saying that he had died of exhaustion. Saheku couldn't believe his ears. This couldn't be. He hadn't died. He couldn't have. He had to go home, where his family was waiting for him. But the voice wouldn't leave him alone, repeating his name over and over and saying that he had died right at his workplace. He didn't remember there being a similar task window in his game. The sword fell from his hands. Come to think of it, the non-existent class of Novice Knight and the pain he felt when he fell in the office were not without reason. It turns out that on that day, when he was rushing to finish his work and earn as much as possible, he didn't sleep. He really did die then. Everything went dark before his eyes. He couldn't accept this truth. What about his daughter, Haru? She was waiting for him at home. His little girl always waited for him. He wanted to spend more time with her, playing and reading her fairy tales. What was the point of working so hard in the end? So Sahekua's condition was terrible. He was crushed. He didn't fully understand what kind of place he was in now. That voice again. So Sahekua heard and saw an inscription saying that if he wanted to start over, he just had to finish the game. Starting over in the game meant the rebirth of the hero. He approached the task window, and every word written there stuck in his memory. After all, it meant that if he completed the game, he would be able to return alive, and that meant he would be able to see his daughter. He cheered up at these thoughts, but then he remembered the monster in the game that he himself had invented. He thought with horror about what he would ultimately have to fight. So Saheku mentally returned to the office, where his director could not accept his final design. They argued. He begged him to think rationally, because Mammon was the final boss in the game, and users would die within a minute of fighting him. So Saheku then decided to add high-level items to increase the user's chances of winning in the final. The director was angry and nervous, because this monster inflicted unimaginable damage on the players, and no items would help defeat him. So Saheku then explained that these items just needed to be upgraded, and then everything would be possible. The director did not trust him on this. After all, upgrading equipment to such a high level would take a very long time. So Saheku was still working on these developments at the time. He said that it would be possible to simply purchase enhancement stone. The director was concerned that in this case, free players would suffer and not everyone would be able to pay. So Saheku, on the contrary, was concerned about the financial issue and believed that the higher the fee, the more profitable it would be. Why worry about it, he thought. He infuriated his boss. He kicked him out of the office, telling him to just go to the business team. Sheets of paper with the developments flew after Saheku. Dodging the papers, he said that he considered this to be permission. Returning to his office, where his colleagues were waiting for him, he announced that he was proposing to create Mammon with 10 phases. One of the team members asked him if the director had really approved it. It seemed crazy to all of them at the time. So Sahuk confirmed that he had managed to convince him, and that since the monster's appearance changes with each phase, 10 images should be selected. The guy was surprised, thinking that a boss with 10 phases was unheard of and simply impossible. But he didn't argue with his boss. So Saheku didn't care at the time, because it wasn't him who would be playing the game. They would get their salary and stock options, which was all they needed. That's what he thought at the time. He told his colleagues to just follow the instruction. The guy objected again that 10 phases was too much. This memory stabbed Saheku in the heart. After all, the monster he had created was invincible. This meant that he would not return home to his daughter. In reality, he was brought back by the guys from the game, whom he hadn't noticed while standing by the chest with the sword, reminiscing about the past. They congratulated him with a smirk. The guys were sure that Captain Aso had saved them in the battle with the monster, so he should be grateful to him for the rest of his life. They also finished changing classes and turned to So, saying that it was time for this guy to survive on his own somehow. He agreed that there was no need to worry about him, so Saheku was now only thinking about what to do next, because So had received a paladin, and only 0.5% of beta users possessed one. Watching the guys led by So walk away, he decided he couldn't let this big shot slip away from him. That would be too easy. Catching up with them, he called out to the captain. He decided to try to befriend him after all. Addressing him by name, he said that he was very cool to have received such a high award for his achievement. So Saheku hugged him around the shoulders in a friendly manner and said that he had courage and had rushed straight into the boss's clutches to protect his comrades. He continued that he had thought he would succeed. So, knowing who had actually defeated the monster, did not want to talk to this stranger at all. So Saheku said that since fate had brought them together in this exam, they should continue in the same spirit. He was counting on Aso and told him so. Aso looked angrily at Saheku, who was obviously upset that Aso had received the class. But what was the point of pride now? His goal was to go home. This stranger had already gotten to him. Aso kicked Saheku in the butt, reminding him of what he had done earlier. He declared that he didn't need someone who treated his comrades like objects. So Saheku was now very angry. He shouted after them to get lost, and that he didn't care. He would see how they would manage without him, without the person who had kept them all alive. He decided that soon they would regret it. He sat down right where he parted ways with them. So Saheku decided to calm down and first think about the situation. He began to piece together the chain of recent events. Despite the differences, he could say with certainty that he was in the game he had been working on. Judging by Toisagaku, there were no significant changes in the strategies and game system, so Saheku couldn't understand why he had ended up here. But he would return home as soon as he finished the game, and at least it was definitely worth trying for that. Following the instructions, he placed his rusty knife in its sheath, but then rusty crumbs fell out, and its strength lost 1 point. So Saheku saw that his strength had already decreased, and realized that this weapon was of little use. He needed to change weapons as soon as possible. He headed for the statue, where classes were assigned. At that moment, an old man called out to him, asking why he was going there. So Saheku did not know who this old man was. The old man said that the village for beginners was in a different place. He advised him to go back because the road outside the exam was difficult and dangerous. So Saheku did not want to listen to anyone's advice on such an important matter, and just waved him away. The old man kept following him, so he asked him to mind his own business. So Saheku knew about the village for beginners. After all, he wrote this game himself, but he needed to get more powerful weapons, and he wondered if it made sense to waste time in the village for beginners. Another weapon, a powerful blade created by the developers to pique users' interest, was right under his nose. The Sacred Sword, Risk Taker. It possessed outstanding attack power and inexhaustible durability. It was truly a higher class S item that even beginners could use. So Saheku created it with the expectation that veteran players would have nothing to do and would be able to find this sword. Now it would be useful to him, and it would be his. He knew where to look for it. The sword was located in an abandoned village that no one could find quickly. It was invisible to other players because of the cyclical eruptions of the volcano. So Saheku moved towards the volcano. An hour later, he finally arrived. The village was located on a volcano called Sinif. It was a peaceful town, with a small number of inhabitants. So Saheku thought that if he could get his hands on some good weapons, he would be able to get rid of the class penalty. Then, he would be able to hire good employees, or rather, assemble a team and safely clear out the monsters, or rather, achieve his goal. So Saheku saw many others in the village who were working tirelessly on the beginner's course. But he did not intend to stay here for long. He decided to carry out a secret mission, known only to him, which would instantly raise him to the very top of the pyramid. So Saheku immediately decided to act. He ran down the village street to the house where the person he needed so much lived. He rushed past the beginners, who were doing some kind of work on this course. A one-eyed girl looked after him in surprise. So Saheku needed the house of the elder of the Gustav family. It was the heart of the village of Sinif. So Saheku figured this out himself. Only he knew where the old man lived, from whom he could get the hidden quest. Not even the most avid players knew this. So Saheku decided to take advantage of this now. The quest, created by the developers and hidden in the village of Sinif, was nothing more than the old man's protective ritual. According to the instructions, all he had to do was perform a small task for the old man and watch his protection ritual. Then, as a token of gratitude, he could receive the sacred blade from the priest. When he reached the old man's house, Saheku began to call loudly for the elder to come out. Saheku was ready to fulfill any of his requests. A young man who was in the house heard him being called. He froze in confusion, not understanding who wanted to see him. Bursting into the elder's room, Sosa Heku called out to the elder. Where did he go? He thought. He couldn't understand who this young man was, and the young man, in turn, came to his senses, widened his eyes, and asked the stranger who he was. Sosa Heku asked him where the elder was, and the young man replied that he had already passed away. Heku shouted in dissatisfaction. His cry raised flocks of birds from the roofs of the houses. Grabbing the young elder by the chest, he began to shake him, saying that everything was fine with him. It was unclear why he had died. The young man finally came to his senses and announced that he was now the elder of the village of Sinif. If Sosa Heku had any business, he could tell him. Sosa Heku thought that since the old man had died, he had most likely passed on his duties to the young man before doing so. He was used to difficulties, and since this young man was the same elder, only younger, it would be even easier to persuade him to perform the ritual. He changed his tactics and asked for forgiveness for his terrible manners. More calmly and gently, he asked the elder if he could help him with anything. The young elder asked him to repeat himself, not understanding what he was talking about. He had no idea what Sosa Heku wanted from him. Sosa Heku had to get a task from him at all costs. He thought there must be something, cleaning the graves, for example. He told the elder that he could help with anything, even if it meant dealing with the volcano dragon, or helping with the protection ritual. There must be something the elder could ask of him. He was ready to do it. The young elder listened to Sosa Heku in surprise, and finally calmly told him to go away. Sosa Heku roared at this response, because his whole plan was falling apart before his eyes. The elder added that he had nothing to offer the stranger. He said sadly that no matter what Sosa Heku did, it would be of no use, so it would be better if he left. Sosa Heku did not give up. He even thought that the elder had gone mad, saying that there was not even a small job for him. He decided to repeat his offer to perform the elder's protective ritual. After all, it was important for the village to perform this ritual. They stood facing each other. The elder understood that Sosa Heku was right, so he did not deny it. He was on the right track, and Sosa Heku's inner voice told him that all that remained was to put pressure on the elder, and he already knew the strategy. Sosa Heku decided that he needed to be a little cunning. He told the young elder that he was actually acquainted with the previous elder. This greatly surprised the young elder. He had never seen the stranger before. Could he be telling the truth? Sosahio was very convincing because he had to get what he wanted. So he asked the elder to trust him and do as he said. He thought to himself that it was almost true, and that he was not lying to the elder, because he had controlled the development of the game. He assured him that he could do it, even though he was young and inexperienced. Sosa Heku almost let slip about the tombstone. The young elder did not understand how this stranger knew everything about performing the protection ritual. He was not sure whether he should trust him. The elder was obliged to protect the village. He suddenly remembered that terrible scene from the past. The village was on fire. He understood that the dragon living in the volcano could incinerate the village, and everyone who lived there again, at any moment. The young elder could not allow this to happen, so he decided to use the services of this stranger. He had to take his word for it. He realized that he would have to borrow the power of another person. He finally made up his mind and introduced himself as Gustav Rhyme, the fourth elder of the village. He looked very seriously at the stranger, and asked him to help with the protective ritual. He agreed to give Sosa Heku the task. Sosa Heku gladly agreed. Finally, the young elder gave in to his persuasion. That's why he takes it so seriously. His attention was drawn to the window that appeared immediately. The task said that a dragon would soon emerge from the volcano. The village would be engulfed in flames. In order to establish a barrier that would protect the village, clean gravestones were needed. Together with the new elder, they had to be put in order. For completing the task, the participant would receive a friendly relationship with the elder. This suited Sosa Heku, and all the conditions were extremely clear. The young elder addressed Sosa Heku, calling him an adventurer. After all, he still did not know his name. Without thinking twice, and still familiarizing himself with the conditions of the task of performing the ritual, Sosa Heku gave his full real name. He decided not to invent anything new, and allowed himself to remain in the game as he was in real life. The young elder agreed, even calling him Mr. Sosa Heku. He even cheered up a little after talking to him. They were being eavesdropped on. At that time, a group of mercenaries called Pachinko gathered in one of the village houses, whose members possessed a certain skill in eliminating people. Holding a virtual mouse in his hand, one of them said that the name Sosa Heku gave him an unpleasant feeling. They used the rat ear skill. It was an exclusive skill of the mercenary class. Cohen addressed the virtual mouse, calling her Nuna, and asked her a question. Could they just get the information and then eliminate the elder and the man? They were all members of the Pachinko gang. Chino, a girl with a striking appearance, joined the conversation and supported him. She asked Faroni, another girl, how much longer they would have to wait there. It was the one-eyed girl who had been on the streets of the village when Sosa Heku was rushing to find the headman's house. She replied that it was not yet time. As soon as he appeared in the village, he immediately headed for that house. This aroused her suspicion, and it needed to be investigated. Faroni asked them if they had ever seen a novice traveler just wandering around the village of Sinif. It was suspicious, to say the least. Why was he looking for the elder's house? She decided that he must know how to get hold of the sacred blade. A plan formed in her mind. She saw no point in bothering to chase after some unknown Sosa Heku. She told everyone that they would just wait for him to find the weapon, and, when the time was right, simply steal the blade. Sosa Heku and the young elder were walking down the street. He asked him how long it would take to get to the tombstone. He replied that it was not far from the village. He added that they would soon be there. Everyone around them began to stare at the passing pair of young people. Sosa Heku couldn't help but notice this, and decided that the atmosphere here was rather strange. The villagers were staring at them. And then, a minute later, a rotten vegetable flew onto the young elder's head. It was quite unexpected. People began pointing at him and shouting that he was insolent and that he had no right to come here after what he had done to their families. They drove him away. The crowd was angry and began throwing more and more things at them. Sosa Heku barely dodged a frying pan and began asking what was going on. He didn't understand what it was all about, but the young elder just quietly asked them to leave as soon as possible. Heku decided that he had to put an end to this. He didn't understand the reasons for such behavior and just wanted to get his sword as soon as possible. After a while, they stood in front of the first gravestone. The elder announced that Sosa Heku's first task was to pull out all the weeds around it. He rolled up his sleeves, ready to get started. He decided that it would only take him 5 minutes to finish, but that was not the case. The elder looked at him from the side and was surprised. Sosa Heku was as nimble as a professional gardener. He did well, although he said that these were not just weeds, but small monsters. He was not in his own world, and only when he held one of them in front of him did he remember how he had created them himself. The weed looked like a turnip with a mouth and eyes. This creature made unpleasant, shrill sounds. Sosa Heku, throwing away another creation, said that in real life they turned out to be even more frightening. He added that he was wrong. They were too detailed, and in his opinion, it was a waste of resources during development. The weed monsters, torn from the ground, began to stand on their stumps and scream. The young elder was even a little frightened by what was happening. An hour later, he declared that it was enough, and that thanks to his work, his grandfather would now sleep peacefully. The gravestone gleamed with cleanliness. Then Sosa Heku thought that now it was clear where this guy came from. The elder was his relative. Then he decided that there should have been 2 of them here. It turned out that another gravestone had been added to the 2 later. The real picture was now slightly different from the original data. It was a unique place for him. Here the elder asked him to follow him, because there were 2 more gravestones ahead of them. Sosa Heku agreed. He was a little tired of wandering around the game he had created with his own hand, but he wanted too much to return home to his daughter. He decided that this small innovation should not prevent him from fulfilling his personal mission. He decided that all he had to do was clear them of weed. And then he saw the second gravestone and the huge monster, the king of weeds. It was as high as level 5 in strength, and Sosa Heku looked at it in horror and realized that he had not created it. It looked terrifying. However, it was still not strong enough to destroy Sosa Heku, and he decided that it was not so important. There was another problem for him. His sword and clothes were of such low level that he did not even know how to use them. In fact, he stood there with a rusty sword in his hands and looked at the huge, toothy weed monster. The monster was ready to repel attacks and roared ferociously. Sosa Heku decided to take a chance and risk it. He knew that either the monster would fall first or his sword would shatter into pieces. He rushed straight at the monster and, shouting that this bush was in for a rough time, swung at it with his old and weak weapon. Sosa Heku had a hard time in this fight, but after a while, the huge weed, more like a tree, fell down in front of the gravestone. Sosa Heku also dropped his sword and fell exhausted to the ground, face up, trying to catch his breath. He thought about how he needed a sacred sword. And then the notification system announced that his level had risen from 1 to 10, and all his characteristics had been updated. The elder was pleased. He approached and said that the gentleman had done an excellent job. Sosa Heku replied with a sigh that they had to finish this before the sun went down. He was tired. He wondered why the young elder wasn't treating him, since his family, the Gustavs, were healers. They continued on their way. The elder said that the last tombstone would be a normal cleanup, and that Sosa Heku would no longer have to suffer so much. He was secretly delighted. After all, even a 5th-level monster weed had exhausted him. 15 minutes later, the elder pointed to the 3rd tombstone and said they had arrived. However, What Sosaheku saw there filled him with utter horror. He suddenly remembered the place he himself had drawn for this game. He asked the elder if he was sure that the third gravestone was located here. The elder replied that he was sure of it, and had said so in the morning. According to him, all the gravestones were located near the village. Then both he and Sosaheku heard these sounds and realized that it would not be easy. Something unimaginable was flying straight at them with a deafening roar, sweeping away all the tall branches on the trees in its path. They both saw a huge wild red eye in front of them. It looked at the travelers with a threat to their lives. It was some kind of cursed predator, and it had a level 50 status in strength and over 2,000 in health. So Saheku didn't understand anything. Why would monster bosses of this level be found near an ordinary village? This creature, like a cyclops crab, was moving straight towards them. The elder said that it was time for them to get out of there. This monster was too strong. They couldn't defeat it. But before he could finish, he noticed that Sosaheku was taking out his rusty sword. He was amazed by his master's determination. The elder wanted to ask Sosaheku what his plan was, but he had already decided that it was worth a try. After all, he was the one who had created this monster. He decided that he should be the one to destroy it. He looked at the elder and said that he would deal with the monster, and that the elder should keep control of his mana. He decided that he might need to heal him. However, the elder said that he would not allow this battle to take place, for it would be very dangerous. So Saheku replied that everything was possible. The monster uses a paralyzing skill if you look into its eyes for more than 3 seconds. He asked if the elder knew why the field boss first immobilizes its opponent instead of attacking. The elder was silent. He did not know. So Saheku smiled and replied that it was because the cursed predator's attack speed was very slow. If you avoided its gaze, you would win. The elder trembled with fear. He understood that Sosaheku was referring to the monster's huge eye. He pointed at the monster. It had already crept closer to them and was about to attack. Sosaheku turned around and started yelling at it, not to dare scare them like that. Then Sosaheku decided to turn around and thank the elder for warning him. However, he realized that the elder was already gone. He had run away. And then he understood everything. The elder had been unable to avoid eye contact with the monster and had been knocked unconscious. He was lying on the ground nearby. So Saheku was angry. He decided that the guy was a complete idiot because he had warned him in advance to be careful. He had the perfect plan. So Saheku planned to attack the monster from a long distance. However, now he had almost no chance of success. The monster was getting closer and closer to the elder. He was lying unconscious, and Sosaheku decided that he just had to change his battle tactics now. He took his sword in his hands and decided to close his eyes and attack blindly. He remembered that he had been involved in every stage of its creation. He still had a chance of winning. Together with his colleagues, they had thought through the strengths and weaknesses of this creature. So Saheku began to lunge at it and shout at it not to touch his sword, not to touch him at all, and not to dare eat the elder. The monster clearly did not expect such resistance, and did not understand why it was prevented from finishing off its first victim. So Saheku decided that the boss's level was not high, and that each time he struck it, the attack was interrupted. He began to lose strength and health. He decided that the difference in strength was not an obstacle. He would be able to defeat the creature without receiving a single wound himself. He attacked and attacked the monster. He heard it losing its strength. So Saheku was already tired, but he decided that with a little more effort, he would defeat the creature. His health was already below 1,000. The notification system announced that he was swinging his sword and that its strength was decreasing with each swing. So Saheku was aware of this himself, but he calculated the monster's remaining health and realized that he had to hold out a little longer. 1 or 2 more strikes, and that would be it. And then he finally heard that the monster had only 1 unit of strength left. So Saheku opened one eye and decided to deliver the final blow. He planned to deal the final blow to the creature and thrust his sword forward. He understood clearly that there was only 1 blow left, but his sword was already broken. And then he did the almost impossible, and even thought to himself that the sword had a strong basic attack. He lay down on the ground and tried to catch his breath after the fight, thinking that he was glad they hadn't come up with an instant death system here. He would definitely be gone now. He himself had only a little health and life left. And then he heard the sound of stones scattering. Looking to the side and crouching on the ground, he saw his sword, or rather, its broken piece, nearby in the grass. And then he realized that the fight was not over yet, and that the huge eye was still trying to survive. So Saheku picked up the broken piece of the weapon and decided to go all the way. He said he would see which of them would emerge victorious. In addition, he attacked faster. He quickly jumped towards the creature. There was no time to hesitate, because both he and the monster had the same amount of strength and health left. So Saheku swung and struck it with a powerful blow, using a titanic technique. He struck the creature directly in the eye with the tip of his sword. The creature screamed fiercely in pain, so Saheku's sword shattered into pieces and trembled. However, he was able to carry out his plan, and the monster lay lifeless at Saheku's feet. He sat down exhausted on the ground and thought that he was too old for all this. And then the notification system announced that he had been promoted to level 20. All his characteristics were updated again. The novice knight in the game had achieved excellent results and now had access to new skills and weapons. So Saheku began to scroll through the messages and see what was available to him. He thought that newbies didn't get anything, but here he was, with new skills. The first thing he saw was the newbie's swinging skill. It was an unskilled swing and depended on the user's strength. The second notification was about the newbie's contact. It was necessary to clumsily resist the enemy's strength, and the result would depend on intelligence. The third message concerned the novice's evasion. If lucky, the user could avoid the enemy's attacks. It depended on speed. And then Saheku became irritated. He didn't understand what nonsense the game was offering him. He shouted that he didn't need such skills, even for free. Then he noticed another message from the system he had angered. It said that he would become stronger if he used them 100 times. So Saheku started shouting that he was an important character and that the system had no idea who it was dealing with. He was angry and shouted, but it just laughed at him and disappeared. So Saheku only managed to tell her indignantly that she would dance for him later. He heard the voice of the elder. He woke up immediately after Saheku dealt with the monster. He asked him if he was all right, and immediately noticed the lifeless body of the creature at Saheku's feet. He just glared at the young elder, thinking that he had only woken up at the end of the fight and had not helped him at all. He began to ask him how he had slept, and that he must have so much strength that he dreams of rafting down the river Styx. He just thanked him for his hard work, ignoring the taunts. He said that it was time to tidy up the third tombstone. These words brought Sahek back to his senses. He looked at him and replied that the elder was right. He thought that the last step in ritual remained. He would finally receive his sacred sword, and the matter would be settled. He asked the elder for a rag to clean it. The elder said he had everything with him, and put down a large bag with the necessary tools and cleaning supplies. Half an hour later, the tombstone was shining with cleanliness under the rays of the setting sun. They both stood in front of it, and then Saheku said that it was finally time to move on to the protective ritual. The elder looked on in bewilderment. He himself wanted to offer to perform the ritual on Saheku. The latter was puzzled and shocked by the request, so Saheku said that the elder should do it. But the young man replied that the thing was that he had used up all his mana, and so he would be glad of Saheku's help with the ritual. Saheku looked at him and did not know what to do. He was furious. He suddenly grabbed the young elder by the collar and asked him what he was doing there and why he had come with him. The young man said fearfully that the gentleman had said he knew how to perform the ritual. He suddenly doubted those words, deciding that he had misunderstood. So Saheku said that they had agreed back then that he would be in charge of cleaning, and the elder would be in charge of the ritual. After all, it was his direct responsibility. It was obvious to him. However, the elder replied that by the knowledge he had supposedly received from previous elders, he meant cleaning. So Saheku was furious at what he heard. He asked why the guy hadn't told him about it right away back then. After all, he thought the guy knew about the ritual. He couldn't understand how the elder could use all his mana and not have any knowledge of rituals. And then it dawned on him. He suddenly understood why the guy hadn't healed him in any of his battles with weeds. All his efforts seemed to have gone down the drain. He thought to himself that if he could see even a line of the elder's mana status, he would be able to understand what his problem was. And then he heard the notification system say that it had begun collecting and analyzing the interlocutor's data. This surprised Saheku. He saw the elder's data loading above his head and thought that all he had to do was wish for it, and it would happen. And then, when he saw the results of the system's analysis, he couldn't understand what it was. They were incomprehensible and unusual to him. The maximum possible amount of mana was 50,000. Gustav Ryman, a young elder, was a high-class healer. His mana and strength reserves were enormous, but his reality index was 0. In fact, he had none. So Saheku didn't understand anything. After all, it was supposed to regenerate automatically. Then the elder said that he had suggested to Saheku before the third tombstone that he return and not fight the monster. He looked miserable. Saheku pondered his words that no matter what he did, his mana would not replenish, and he could no longer use magic either. He cried and lamented that he knew he was useless. However, he wanted to perform the protection ritual at all costs. He wanted to do everything he could. So Saheku thought that it was pointless now. Without the elder's help, he was without a sword. He couldn't take it over by himself. He thought that there might be another way. Then they both barely managed to stay on their feet. They decided it was an earthquake. Looking at the volcano near the village, they saw smoke and ash rising above it. The young elder, Raymond, was terrified and said aloud that he did not want this at all. He started to run away, leaving So-Sa Heku behind. So Hakuk shouted after him that he didn't understand where he was running to. He just thought to himself that the guy was strange, and he couldn't understand him at all. He sat in the tavern and thought about what to do next. Returning to the village of newcomers was not an option. Without a decent weapon, he would not be accepted into the team. Besides, he didn't want to leave Captain Aso's strong team. He had to get the sacred blade somehow, at any cost. The owner of the establishment was staring at him intently. So Saheku suddenly said Reima's name aloud. He said he wasn't hired to babysit him. The man heard this and suddenly recognized So Saheku as the same fool who had been hanging around the young elder in the village recently. He came closer and splashed a cup of beer in his face. The man angrily began to chase So Saheku out of his establishment and asked what he was doing there. He added that Reima's friends were not allowed in and asked him to get lost. Saheku stood up and asked what he had done, but he wanted to add one more thing, that it was actually he who had worked tirelessly to create this reality. But he said something else, that from now on, his actions would be self-defense. After a while, the man fell trembling at his feet, so Saheku asked if he finally respected him. The man trembled and agreed, although he was thinking that if he had the chance, he would make this scoundrel pay for everything. So Saheku sat down in front of him and asked, why did all the villagers want to overthrow Rayamani so desperately? He didn't understand what the problem was and why they were throwing tomatoes at him. The man cleared his throat and said that he seemed unaware of Rayamani's deeds, and that it would be better for the stranger not to get involved with him. Suddenly, his face froze, and he barely managed to utter the words that he was destroying the villagers. So Sahuk couldn't believe it, this crybaby who had just run away, his heels flashing as soon as the volcano spat out its ashes. He turned to the tavern owner sitting opposite him and asked what exactly he had done, because it was hard to believe in light of his recent actions. The tavern owner asked him if he had seen an abandoned house near the village. So Saheku immediately remembered that when they were walking with the elder to the gravestone, he had indeed seen the remains of a building resembling a house at the foot of the hills. When he asked the young headman what was there, he said it was his friend's house, but now it was empty. So Saheku then pulled the game map from his memory and remembered that this area had previously belonged to the village. Now it was overgrown wasteland, and only bouquets of flowers lay near the ruins of the house, as if it were a grave. The tavern owner continued his story, saying that Raymond had destroyed all the members of the family who lived in that very house. One day, the volcano awoke. Its fire-breathing mouth spewed stones, ash, and flames. The villagers were very frightened because it meant that the dragon would soon appear. They rushed to the young elder for help. They shouted and called out to him, demanding that he quickly begin the ritual and protect them. Everyone rushed to the tombstone to perform the ritual. However, after trying, the elder realized that he could not do anything. He sat there on his knees and kept saying that he did not have enough mana. The tavern owner personally begged him to do something, because the dragon was already right in front of them. The village was in grave danger. Raymond could do nothing. Tears streamed from his eyes as he asked himself why nothing was working. Suddenly, the earth shook throughout the entire area. The sky lit up with flashes of fire. Rocks and sparks rained down on the village. When the tavern owner looked up, a fire-breathing monster dragon was circling in the sky directly above them. Raymond screamed in horror that this couldn't be happening. He didn't know how to complete the protective ritual and save the village. When the tavern owner saw the dragon, his first thought was for the little girl. He shouted her name, Ellen. His cry echoed somewhere high above. She was a kind-hearted child. She took care of her elderly grandfather. She was in the meadow near the house when the dragon saw her and swallowed her whole. That day, the tavern owner lost his neighbors and the girl who was like a daughter to him. Riemann did not explain why he could not use mana. The blood of the elder flowed through his veins, but he had undermined the trust of the villagers. So Saheku just sighed. He stood up, put a coin on the table, thanked the tavern owner for the tasteless beer, bowed, and walked silently to the exit. The tavern owner was simply stunned by what he saw. What kind of reaction was that? He had just told him a heartbreaking story, and he just walks away without saying a word. He tried to stop him. So Saheku walked on without turning back at his call. He only repeated his words about protection. Heiku said that the young man who had lost his family had been given responsibility for the fate of the village, and everyone wanted him to solve all the problems right away. So Saheku turned to the tavern owner and added that he should be ashamed of himself because he was a grown man. Wasn't he ashamed to say such things? He couldn't calm down about Raymond. Now he understood much better what was happening to him and why the villagers had attacked him. As he walked away, He thought about how selfish these people were to treat the village head that way. They thought that Sosa-Heku himself didn't know the history of the village. The warrior who wielded the sacred sword perished. His companion, a priest, traveled to the kingdom to fulfill his last wish. He wanted to help the people who had lost their homes in the battle against the monster. That was his mission in the game. Uniting under his leadership, the residents later built a village called Sinif. However, peace did not reign there for long. The dragon Freyed, who had been sleeping on the mountain, awoke from his slumber. In a single morning, he turned the fertile land into a volcano. He attacked the peaceful inhabitants of the village. Then the defense of the village fell on the shoulders of the descendants of the priest of the Gustav family, on the ancestor of that very young priest, Rimin. The ancient ancestor and founder of the village of Sinif knew that one day the dragon would awaken, so he left a protective tombstone to save the inhabitants. But its creation took too much energy from the spellcaster and affected the length of his own life. That was the price. Knowing this, the Gustav family still sacrificed themselves to protect the small population at that time. After performing the protective ritual, the residents were saved, and the ancestor gave the people a peaceful sky above the earth. But everyone completely forgot about this. So Sa-Heku remembered how vegetables were thrown at Rama in the square. In any case, it seemed he knew the answer. The reason why Rama's mana was not recovering lay in psychological trauma. Depression is not uncommon among newcomers who have experienced severe shock. So Sa-Heku decided that this was his specialty. He decided to heal Rama's wounded soul and ran from the tavern towards the young priest's house. So Sa-Heku burst into the headman's house. From the doorway, he shouted that it was time for special training, but he wasn't there. He didn't know where he had gone. At that moment, Cohen, carrying a bag that kept flapping on his shoulder, thought that although it was small, it was still heavy. The other members of the mercenary group were waiting at the entrance to the tomb with a sacred sword. Cohen threw the bag on the ground. When they opened it, they saw that he had brought the young village headman. Cohen said that they weren't thrilled about this plan either, but they needed the sword. Raymond was confused about who they were and how they dared to kidnap someone, but he couldn't run away. He was tied up. Parfioni leaned toward him and said that they had overheard his recent conversation with a stranger about how he could activate the protective tombstone. They wanted to get the sacred sword. Riemann cried out in fear that he didn't understand what sword they were talking about. He knew nothing about it. The girl didn't like his answer at all. She called Cohen over and another girl named Chino. She added that the young elder would soon become more talkative. Cohen twisted him so that he screamed. The one-eyed girl said that they had seen his status, so they knew that he had no mana left and most likely would not be able to resist them. Chino approached him with a syringe filled with some kind of liquid, promising that just one injection would give even a 70-year-old grandfather wings. The girl looked a little crazy. She raised the syringe with the medicine and smiled. She said they were doing this because they wanted to get their hands on the sword, but they were also thinking of him because he would protect the village. Cohen held him tightly and assured him that Nuna's skills in mixing poisons were simply masterful. He added with a smile that the only downside to such an injection was that the elder would most likely become a fool after the injection. Raymond did not want to become a different person and a fool. His lips trembled, and his whole body was covered in sweat. He tried to break free from Cohen's grip, demanding that they stop immediately and let him go, because he was the village elder, but it was impossible. Cohen held him even tighter and ordered him to stand still and not argue with them. Then they all heard someone's voice ordering all the gang members not to move. They turned around and saw the stranger. As soon as Sa-Heku didn't find him at home, he immediately guessed that something had happened to him. He followed their trail to look for him. Seeing the whole company and Raymond, he jokingly said that he thought Raymond was practicing and wanted to praise him, but he had managed to get himself into trouble. Raymond saw hope. Since the master was here, he would save him. So Sa-Heku assessed the odds, called everyone thieves, and suggested they talk it out. Chino, who had the syringe with the solution, turned to Pharaoh and asked what they should do. She saw that the stranger understood the situation correctly. Pharaoh didn't understand why Chino was so afraid of the traveler, since he had nothing but a broken weapon. They decided to deal with him quickly. With a cry, they pounced on Sa-Heku. Pharaoh thought that their opponent was a low-level adventurer. They knew that they were 40 times stronger than him, so they decided that they couldn't lose to him. They needed to check his stats. Cohen pulled a weapon from behind his back and, lunging at Sa-Heku, said that he should have run away from here earlier. Now he had only himself to blame. A notification window popped up and gave them information about the bandits' two-handed active skill, Twin Vipers. Cohen really seemed to merge with his two weapons and dealt with the traveler in a matter of seconds. At least, that's how it seemed to him. But what was this? The traveler seemed to have vanished. Cohen couldn't understand where he was. Chino held Rama, while Cohen had to deal with the stranger. Seeing Cohen's surprise, she asked what was going on. Cohen stared ahead. Suddenly, a light began to grow in the darkness, and a silhouette began to emerge. Kohen was sure he had torn him to pieces. The silhouette that appeared was none other than Sosa-Heku, who asked them who was fighting here. He had a thick stick in his hands. Sosa-Heku had completely forgotten that he had a piece of junk instead of a sword. The pop-up notification window told him to take anything he wanted in this forest. Pharaoh Anna couldn't believe it. They certainly didn't expect this. She didn't understand who this guy was. When she tried to load the status window to find out about the stranger, an error occurred. This was impossible, given the significant difference in levels. She was perplexed. Could this vagrant adventurer really defeat professional mercenaries like them? Pharaoh understood that it was necessary to recall everyone and get out of there as soon as possible. But she still hoped for Kohen's skills. Sosa-Heku knew that he had no normal weapons, but he decided to use improvised ones. Their durability was high, and so was their attack power. He picked it up in the forest and decided to use a log. He looked at Kohen and said that they could continue their duel. Kohen looked at Sosa-Heku in bewilderment and did not understand what to expect from this madman. He decided to attack first and ran towards him. Sosa-Heku then, from above. He deftly dodged his enemy's attacks. He counted his blows and calculated his tactics. He struck once on the left, then twice in a row on the right, which was too easy and predictable for Sosa-Heku. Usually, game development companies are always short-staffed, and managers have a lot of work on their shoulders. This meant only one thing, that the entire process of coming up with the game mode for player confrontation was planned by Sosa-Heku himself. And now, he knew all of his opponent's moves in advance. The blonde girl started yelling at Kohen to finish it. She couldn't see Heku's status. She added that this guy was probably too much for them to handle. They should forget about the sacred sword and retreat before it was too late. The second girl was surprised that Pharaoni was suggesting surrender. It wasn't like her at all. She was still holding the young priest by the hair. Kohen thought to himself that he had made a mistake in the fight with the stranger, and that he should have checked his status and strength first. He still didn't know exactly what to do. After all, he saw that all his attempts to attack him were useless, so Sosa-Heku was surprised. He had no idea that no one could see his status and condition window. He decided that the creators were useless. It was a genre of game in which a large number of players could interact with each other, and New Fantasy was one of them. When playing such a game, in order to assess your opponent, you had to check their status frequently. There were only two reasons why this was impossible. The first was if the opponent's level was much higher than the second, or your own. The second was if the opponent had never checked the status window before. Therefore, it was impossible to load this information later in battle. Sosa-Heku declared that it was too late for them to run away from him. He understood that they would all have a hard time now. His opponents stood and watched as the knights rushed towards them, determined to protect the tomb at any cost. One of them ordered the others to immediately expel the enemies from their village. Pharaoni cried out in surprise, not understanding how they had found out about them. She promised to return and get even with Sosa-Heku. They rushed to flee from the tomb, and the knights shouted at them to stop. Sosa-Heku only thought cunningly that they believed they could defeat him, but he was able to outwit them all. After all, it was a reason for expulsion. In such battles between game users, there were certain rules, and they had broken them. He glanced at the young priest. He was sitting on the ground, doomed and suffering. Sosa-Heku asked if he was all right. Riemann rushed to him with tears in his eyes. He confessed to the master that he was incredibly scared. Sosa-Heku took pity on him and suddenly picked up the syringe, saying that those people had dropped it there. He smiled slyly and asked if he should give the priest an injection after all. Riemann begged him not to do it and confessed that he had even drunk the potion. He hoped it would help him regain his mana. However, there was no result. He was in despair. Sosa-Heku said he was just joking. He reached out his hand and helped him to his feet. Raymond continued to thank Sosa-Heku for saving him, with tears in his eyes, and said he had despaired. He thought that the master had already left his village and moved on. And then he saw something familiar in Sosa-Heku's hands. Sosa-Heku said, handing the fragments to Raymond, that he had found them in the backyard of his house. The priest carefully took the wooden fragments from his hands. He told Raymond that it had been broken into several pieces. Sosa-Heku could not find the young priest in the house, and kept calling for him to come out. Then he suddenly noticed something wooden and unusual nearby in the backyard. He looked at the object, coming closer to it, and suddenly realized that it most resembled a staff. He told Raymond that if the staff was broken, all that would remain was to practice his skills. Then the priest's mana reserves would begin to grow again. Looking at the broken pieces of wood, he replied that he was a failure. He considered himself probably the only healer unable to control his mana. He added that his body was so exhausted that he was constantly vomiting and feeling nauseous. He always felt helpless and powerless. And even now, looking at everything happening around him, he had no idea what else he could do in this world. As he listened to him, Saheku thought to himself that he had despised this guy so much at first, but he had no idea that he was so determined. He suddenly wondered what his boss at work would have done in this situation. He remembered how they had discussed that Saheku's proposed method might not work. Director Wu said that there was a limit to how much pressure could be put on people, and they only had one of the 3 interns left. He asked what would happen if he also quit because of Saheku's work style. Saheku replied that he understood that he was always too persistent, but he still disagreed. Saheku hated it when anyone threw a tantrum in the office if they received negative feedback from their work. The director disagreed with him. He said that even a manager couldn't withstand such pressure. He asked if Saheku realized how difficult it was to make his demands a reality. He demanded that everyone make the impossible possible and try harder. Saheku thought about it then. The director explained that it was wrong to threaten them and that seniors don't behave like that. After all, Saheku doesn't know what they all had to go through. Heku then asked the director for advice on this matter, and he replied that in such situations, it is worth saying different words to people, that hard work always brings worthy results. It was these words that Saheku remembered when talking to Raymond, standing at the stone gravestone in the night. He said them to the young priest, and saw how the guy looked at him with surprise and gratitude. Saheku added that effort is what we all spend on finding the right path, and the fact that he was experiencing difficulties now was normal. It only proved that he was on the right path. So Saheku told Riemann that he should not give up under any circumstance. Tears appeared in the young priest's eyes again. He listened silently and clenched the fragments of his staff tightly in his palm. So Saheku said all this to himself, thinking how unlike him it was, and how rarely anyone could hear such words from him. He had changed here, and then suddenly everything around them shook, and the ground began to slip away from under their feet. Riemann staggered and lost his balance. They both looked toward the volcano, and their faces reflected fear and despair. So Saheku glanced at the volcano and was angry again. Something was interfering with his plans again, and it was more untimely than ever. The volcano had awakened. In addition to smoke and ash, fiery lava was now spewing from its vent. A slight earthquake began, but that was only half the trouble. A fire-breathing dragon emerged from the volcano. It was a monster boss, and it was already roaring ferociously with its mouth. The villagers also noticed it, and began to run away, screaming in all directions. The village was once again in grave danger. It was the boss of the Dragon Frieden training ground, 99th level in strength, and S-class in status. The tavern owner ordered everyone to take cover. He pointed to a place behind a protective tombstone, believing it to be the safest place. Everyone rushed there, and then they saw Raymond standing nearby. At that moment, the dragon was already flying towards the village, and so Saheku realized with horror that Frieden's minion had already reached the village. So Saheku had only the club he had picked up in the forest in his hand. This complicated matters. He did not know how to defeat it. He asked Remen if the priest had anything even remotely resembling a potion, to buy him some time while he tried to regain his mana. The priest gave Saheku a small bottle of liquid, and said it was a fireproof potion. It was all he had with him at the moment. So Saheku grabbed the bottle and said that he would try to deal with the monster outside, while Raymond should focus all his attention on practicing. He was eager for the boy to be able to restore his mana through his own efforts. Raymond replied that he still doubted that he would succeed. So Sahek drank the potion and asked if he had ever seen a healer whose mana reserve reached 50,000 units, and that was exactly how much he had. He added that it was Raymond, the priest. The boy stood and listened attentively to Sahek. He repeated his every word, because it was true. He completely forgot how he had talked to his grandfather, and asked him if he could become his follower. He wasn't sure of himself back then. He added that he couldn't control his mana properly. He was overcome by constant doubts. However, his grandfather just laughed and replied that Raymond only saw one side and didn't notice the other. He asked if his grandson knew the story of how their village, now called Sinif, came to be. He told him that their ancestor had taken care of those who had suffered during the monster attack. He healed and cured all their wounds. Gradually, more and more people began to come to him, and that is how this place came to be. Their native village. It was here that people had always been helped since ancient times. Raymond listened attentively to his grandfather. He added that before becoming an elder, their ancestor had devoted himself to this mission and spent his entire life selflessly serving the people. Their family's calling was not to obtain the title of elder, but to be priests who extended a helping hand. He told Raymond to always remember this. They wanted only one thing, to help people, and therein lay their great strength. Raymond remembered how happy he had been at first, and how he had been friends with that girl. His grandfather advised him to focus on what he had told him. Then everything that would bother the boy in the future would resolve itself. The dragon was getting closer and closer to the tombstone in the village. It roared fiercely and began to breathe fire. So Saheku was unharmed and realized that the fire potion he had taken from Riemini was working well. It was quite effective against the dragon's attack. The dragon began to attack Saheku more and more often. He called on Remen to gather his thoughts and come up with something with his mana before the dragon finally defeated Saheku. He gathered himself and tried to strike back at the dragon monster with a sharp throw. Saheku knew that he could not win alone. He shouted to Remen that only he could handle all this, whether he wanted to or not. He believed in the young priest and prayed for him. In turn, Remen stretched out his palms toward his ancestor's tombstone and also began to call on all the gods for help. He thought to himself that he was constantly haunted by reminders that he had to do his part. His father had simply run away, and he had to inherit his grandfather's place and role early. Thoughts of this clouded his mind, and he completely forgot what was really important. After all, his grandfather had told him that he should simply strive sincerely to help people. Reeming remembered this today and understood everything. He decided that now he knew exactly what his grandfather had meant when he spoke to him back then. He turned to the gravestone again. He said aloud that his name was Gustav Raymond. He was the fourth priest of the Gustav family, and above all, he was the one who brought benefit to people in the name of light. Tears appeared in his eyes, and his soul became light and calm. It worked, and the gravestone began to glow. So Saheku saw how brightly the stone slab was burning, and, reflecting the dragon's endless attacks, said that the guy had finally succeeded. Then the knights, seeing the danger, began to shout that they needed to protect the elder immediately. So Saheku saw them running towards the gravestone and realized that they had come to their senses, and that now everything would be different. They returned when they saw the volcano erupt. While the knights distracted the dragon's attention, Saheku decided that this was an excellent chance and ran to Raymond. He jumped up to him and, seeing the greenish energy ball in his hands, asked how his mana was doing. He replied to his master that he himself was taken aback by the changes. He showed Saheku how his mana was quickly replenishing itself. Saho told him that it was too early to rejoice, as he still had to activate the protective field over the tombstone and the village. He ordered him to concentrate. Raymond replied that he would do everything as required, and then they both heard the cries of the villagers running towards them. They were already close. The tavern owner and everyone who had fled with him to the shelter appeared from behind the trees. They were surprised to see who was there. The tavern owner looked at Remen and stood silently, not knowing what to say or do. The priest was frightened. The man said he was glad that Remen had come to their aid. He knew he was somewhat to blame for this young priest. A little earlier, Saheku had come to his tavern with a bag in his hand. The tavern owner was surprised by the guest. He threw the bag into his hands and said that it contained Remen's staff. He added that it fell apart into small pieces every time Raymond tried to use his mana. At first, the tavern owner did not understand what all this talk was about. So Saheku asked him to open the bag and look inside. He told the man that the young priest should have lost his faith long ago, but he continued to move toward his goal every time. As he left, Saheku asked the tavern owner to look closely at what had happened to him. He said that Raymond was going to activate the tombstone. In doing so, he would surely lose almost all the years of his life. The man asked what Sahuik was talking about. He did not know what it meant to activate an ancestor's tombstone. So Sahuik turned around and replied that the protective tombstone would be opened in exchange for the spellcaster's life. He asked if the villagers had never heard of this and didn't know the outcome. The man stood there pensively, looking at Raymond by the stove. He stepped toward him and told the young priest that he had always hated the guy because of his past mistake. He had lost many people dear to him back then, and even now, he wanted to reproach Raymond for not saving that girl, Ellen, back then. The young priest stood silently and listened to the man. Tears of grief welled up in his eyes again. The man clenched his fist and continued. He told the boy that at the same time he wanted to apologize for hurting him, being preoccupied only with his own pain. These words struck Raymond. He looked at the man and, calling him uncle, wanted to say something. But the man bowed to the boy and added that he was asking him to create that very barrier around the village and save its inhabitants. He turned to the people and began to shout for them to listen to him carefully. He said that they would no longer commit shameful acts, and they would not wait and sit around while the dragons dealt with them. He added that Raymond would not have to answer for them all. The boy listened to him, crying. His mana level was growing, and had already reached 377 units by this point. He turned to the gravestone. Leaning against it with his hands, he began to beg that everything would work out for him, and that he would be able to save everyone and put up a protective barrier. He began to say that this time, he had to protect the village from Friday. His mana exceeded 500 units, and the dragon was already approaching the village. It roared fiercely, and all the inhabitants were in a panic. All hope rested on the young priest. In addition to the monster boss, other dragons were flying towards them. They began to throw fireballs. Almost the entire village was engulfed in flames and fires. So Saheku understood that Friday had indeed awakened to attack Remen himself. That was his true goal. He decided that now he had no choice but to try to suppress his aggression. Then the tavern owner began to shout and curse the dragon. He called him a cursed lizard and said that if he had decided to wipe their village off the face of the earth, he should first deal with him personally. So Saheku was shocked by this turn of events. The dragon lunged at him. Soheku started yelling at the man that he was crazy and wanted to die in vain. The man only replied that he should let him go and that he had to buy time for Raymond. The dragon was very close and began to throw fireballs at them. Then the warning system announced that a skill had been activated. It was the novice's dodge. Riemann began to shout at Saheku, seeing what was happening. However, the residents held him back, not allowing him to be distracted from the tombstone. So Saheku lost consciousness, and the tavern owner held him by the shoulders and shouted. He wanted him to wake up, but it was useless. He shook his shoulders in vain and told Saheku to look at him. The use of that very skill came as a surprise to everyone, and so Saheku was temporarily out of the game. The fire-breathing dragon was advancing. It flew on its huge wings, straight at the two of them. The tavern owner tried in vain to wake Saheku and bring him to his senses. He realized that this was probably the end for him, and then a magical red circle appeared in the sky above their heads. It was unlike any spell he had ever seen before. The dragon was furious and began to wheeze, and the tavern owner could not believe his eyes. He kept looking at the sky and realized that this was the work of the monster. He had already seen something similar on the day when a monster like this burned the outskirts of the village to the ground. Only this one was bigger and therefore stronger. The man understood that as soon as this magical circle fell on their village, everything living here would come to an end. He was terrified. The villagers scattered in all directions. They screamed. Everything was burning and blazing with tongues of flame. Riemann also looked up. He saw what was happening and panicked. Then he remembered the words of Saheku, who had told him that Friday was gradually developing his skills. They were moving from one-off attacks to mass destruction. The last assault was a year ago, and everyone remembered it. So now it meant that his actions this time would affect the entire village, not just the outskirts. He said that Riemann had to save everyone and prevent possible damage. The young elder remembered last year again, and that very girl, Ellen, who had died with her family. He couldn't let that happen now. His mana level had finally reached 50,000 units. He was ready for anything. He decided that today he would save everyone and not let a single resident die. His hands touched the tombstone again, and everyone standing next to him saw something impossible begin to happen. Everything was illuminated with light. They began to shout to each other so that everyone could see what Raymond was doing. But then, large cracks formed on the protective tombstone. Without removing his palms, Remen thought only that he wanted to apologize to the villagers once more. He was able to break the stone slab with his mana, and a notification window appeared in front of him. It said that the elder's tombstone was requesting all of his infinite mana. This shocked Raymond. He didn't understand why this was happening, and why he had to give up all the mana he had spent so long restoring. However, the notification system said that he had to agree to this if he wanted to create a protective barrier. Raymond looked sadly at his palms once more, thinking about what he was about to lose. He clenched his fists one last time, wanting to feel the power and energy, and then he understood everything. He smiled and decided that this was exactly what his grandfather wanted from him. He would help all people today. The notification system announced that the contract had been concluded, and at that very moment, the tombstone glowed with even more light and energy. Raymond stood nearby and watched the tombstone change. Magical balls began to appear from its depths. They turned into a single huge green dome that rose higher and higher into the sky. The flames and fire bursting from the dragon's mouths collided with the protective barrier that the priest had been able to put up over the village. No matter how hard the monsters tried to break through, it was all in vain. The dome began to transform into a huge gray-haired man. He dealt with the flames, and all the villagers shouted that a huge mirage was hanging over the village. He smashed the monster's meteorites into small pieces, and everyone realized that it was Riemini who had done it. The young boy also looked in amazement at the huge mirage he had been able to summon to his aid. He remembered his grandfather's words again. He said that his eyes were clouded, and he could not see well. But he remembered that on the back of the gravestone were words addressed to his descendants. They said that, being immoral and weak, the elder had erected a protective stone, and therefore, when a truly talented person appeared, he would ask him to continue his work. A huge stream of energy appeared in the form of a whirlpool, with lightning in the sky. They spun meteorites from monsters. Even the dragon itself could not resist such enormous power. The words also said that the ancestor would respond to the call of the people, and they would find eternal peace on their land. The dragon was incinerated by this mighty force. It fell. It disappeared, leaving behind only ashes and ruins. The tavern owner sat there with So-Sa-Heku in his arms and saw everything, just like the other villagers. Everyone was simply amazed by what was happening. They had never seen anything like it in their lives. However, realizing that the whole village had been saved and that they were no longer in danger, the people began to shout with joy. Raymond also saw everything and silently remembered his grandfather's last words about believing in himself. After a while, he also raised his head and began to cry at the words that someday he would become a truly great priest and help people. He understood that he had just done that. Then, So-Sa-Heku began to move and sighed as he awoke. The man from the tavern was sitting above him and asking how he was feeling. The notification system said that the novice's dodge skill had been successfully activated. So-Sa-Heku, not yet realizing how it all happened to him, understood from the faces of those around him and the rest that Raymond had succeeded. The boss of the Friday field was amazed. No rewards were given because damage data was detected. Everyone asked Raymond what that huge spirit above the village was. No one knew that such a powerful force was contained in the tombstone. The elder replied that it was most likely an ancient spell. It had been deliberately left by the first elder to defeat Friday. And then he noticed the spirit's gaze on him. Raymond looked up with a questioning expression on his face. He felt as if their eyes had met, and in the next moment, the spirit began to slowly dissolve into the air, leaving no trace of itself. Only a memory remained. The villagers thanked Raymond, saying that he had done a great job. The tavern owner added that he was very sorry that they had accepted his sacrifice, and as a matter of course, Raymond replied that everything was fine, and that he was also very sorry. He understood how much he had hurt the feelings of others. He added that from now on, in memory of Ellen and the others who had died, he would become the priest they would be proud of. He then declared that the time had come to dig up the elder's grave. This shocked those around him. Everyone began to ask what he meant. However, he replied that he would explain later. Everyone set to work and picked up their shovels. After a while, they dug up a huge sacred sword wrapped in cloth. It had been lying there for a long time. One of the knights asked the elder if this was the warrior's sword that had been passed down from generation to generation, and if he was sure it should be given away. At first, the residents did not agree that the sacred blade should be entrusted to a stranger. However, Riemann replied that priests did not need swords at all. Nevertheless, he understood why the former elder had kept and guarded it. It was not in vain, for he knew that a new hero would appear to save the village when it was in grave danger, and he was talking about So-Sa-Heku. He took the sword and brought it to him with words of gratitude. Raymond added that he was obliged to accept this blade as a gift from the villagers, and that it was only thanks to him that he was able to replenish his mana reserves and save everyone from the monster attack. He thanked So-Sa-Heku from the bottom of his heart. So-Sa-Heku just bowed silently and smiled. He was grateful and happy to finally receive his cherished sword. He took it by the hilt with his hand, as if to make sure that he now had a stronger weapon. Riemann stood proudly before him. So-Sa-Heku raised it high, so that its blade shone as if proclaiming its power. He accepted the gift from the villagers. It was the sacred sword of the S-class risk-taker. Its characteristics indicated that its durability was infinite. It dealt half physical damage. This was great, because this damage would be enough for So-Sa-Heku to fight boss monsters. He thought that Haru just needed to wait a little longer. In the task window that appeared, he read that the elder's protective ritual, whose sole purpose was to clean the gravestones, had been completed. Clean gravestones were required to protect the village. At the end of the entry, a stamp now glowed, indicating that the task had been completed. Everything that had been destroyed needed to be put in order, and So-Sa-Heku stayed to help the villagers. They all participated in clearing the rubble and restoring the building. It required a lot of effort and time, but they managed to do it. So-Sa-Heku was tired, but he was glad that one task was behind him. He could move on. Now he had to recruit subordinates, or to be more precise, assemble a team, as is customary in games. But as soon as he set off, the elder caught up with him on a cart and called out to him. So-Sa-Heku did not want him to accompany him, because he had a lot of work to do. The young elder, addressing Mr. So, explained that he was going to go with him. He needed to go outside the village to broaden his horizon. So Saheku objected and said that the elder could not leave the villagers alone. Rayama was ready with a response, saying that the tavern owner would take care of everything in his absence and there would be no problem. So Saheku shouted that he had almost no strength left, and who would go on such a journey without mana? He said he would check everything himself right now. To convince him, so Saheku decided to check his status window, thinking that then the elder would have no more arguments. So Saheku pressed the necessary button after the request and loaded all the data about the young elder Remen. Gustav Ryman sat with his hands on his hips on the cart's trestles and smiled slyly at Mr. So Saheku knew that Remen had spent all his mana on a protective stone. However, he did not yet know what he had received in return. This information struck him because a message appeared in the window saying that Riemann had been granted a blessing called the Fruit of Effort. It granted a fatal blow that applied to all healing spells used. So Saheku couldn't believe it and looked at Raymond. Raymond said that he was also surprised at first. He had no idea that he would receive a real blessing. Perhaps the previous elder had granted it to him. The young elder told Mr. So that he still had 5,000 mana points left. With a smile on his face, he asked Mr. So if he would now accept him into his company and allow him to join the team. Mr. So's stubbornness was broken, and he congratulated Raymond on joining the ranks of his subordinates. So Saheku added that he should not count on a salary, as he would not be with them on their travels. He climbed into the cart with Raymond, who asked Mr. So where they were headed now. He thought they should go to the crowded capital. So Saheku objected, and said that they would go to a village where there were workers. The elder asked him in surprise, what kind of workers? The master confirmed that they needed a tank. This is a player who distracts the enemy's attention to himself in order to organize a raid. Raymond understood everything. He was a priest, and the gentleman was a damage dealer who inflicted the main damage on enemies. He thought that only a tank was missing, and then Raymond shouted loudly from an unexpected jolt. The horse was so frightened that it jerked and reared up. It seemed that they had run into a large rock or tree. So Saheku flew upside down in the cart from the surprise, bruising himself and getting bumps and bruises. He shouted at Raymond that this was unthinkable and began to scold him for not being able to drive the cart properly. Raymond had already come to his senses and told his master that there was no need to go to the village. It suddenly dawned on him. Mr. So was surprised, and the question hung on his lips. Raymond exclaimed that he had completely forgotten that he knew the Holy Guardian. So Saheku's surprise knew no bound. The Holy Guardian was the strongest tank in his game, New Fantasy, and he knew him. This strongest player had, according to his own scenario, a rare high class on par with Paladin. So Saheku wondered to himself how Raymond knew such an outstanding person. It couldn't be. Then he began to guess. After all, Raymond couldn't use mana. However, he somehow managed to pass the class change exam. He knew how these exams were conducted and had personally developed the instructions in his department. He looked at Raymond and asked if he was right in thinking that the Holy Guardian had helped him pass the exam. Raymond just smiled in response. He happily announced that they were not far from his home village of Coward. So he asked Mr. So to stop by there. So Saheku interrupted Raymond's rambling speech and asked him why he was so sure that he was there now. Raymond remembered how, after the test, the Guardian himself had told him that he was going there, and what did they have to lose? He said they should go and try to find him. So Saheku sat down at the task window to look at his current stats. He couldn't understand what had happened to his abilities. He tried to calculate his capabilities during combat because they were not infinite. The window did not provide any information about Saheku's status. The system was blocked by the administrator. This shitty game angered Heku. Raymond distracted him again. He called out to the gentleman and decided to ask him why he had suddenly become an adventurer. So Saheku was surprised at Raymond's curiosity. Raymond replied that he had simply never heard his story. He added that he had been watching Mr. So, and that for some reason it seemed to him that he was in a great hurry to get somewhere. So Saheku thought for a moment. It seemed that he was far away from here now. He remembered his little daughter. In his memories of her, she reached out to him with her little hand, grabbing his finger with her palm. And then he imagined how they ran hand in hand along the path in the park. Haru laughed. She was happy. His thoughtfulness did not go away. He became very sad. Finally, he replied to Raymond that he lived far away and dreamed of returning home. But in order to return home, he had to defeat Mammon, who was blocking his way home. The elder asked the gentleman fearfully who he meant. Could it be the one they call the Emperor of Monsters? Stop fidgeting, said Sahuk. His family was waiting for him. Therefore, his task was to defeat him and return home. Now Raymond was satisfied with his story. So Saheku noticed that the horse had stopped. He turned to Rimin and asked what had happened. He said that it seemed to him that they were standing still. While they were talking, Sosa Heku had not been paying attention to the road because he was not driving the carriage, and now they did not know where they were. Apparently, they had gotten lost. So Sahuk became angry with Raymond, rudely calling him a fool whose brain didn't work. How could he have trusted him? Raymond had promised Mr. So that he would take him to the village guard. Raymond felt that something was wrong here. Why had the road brought them back here? After all, there was a sign for the village of Coward at every fork in the road. He followed the signs towards Coward. Darkness was falling quickly in the forest. Suddenly, they noticed with horror thousands of lights around them, like pairs of glowing eyes. So Saheku knew that mobs sometimes appeared here. They possessed a high level of intelligence. So Saheku wondered if the goblins had deliberately confused them to lure them into a trap. They had to return urgently. But when they turned back to the road they had come from, they saw that they could not pass. The road was blocked by a wall of mud. Riemann shouted this to his master. So Saheku saw it himself. So thought that these goblins had become so cunning in the latest version. He saw that they were everywhere. The goblins were getting closer and closer to them. Their eyes were bulging, and they were chattering their teeth. Their spears were flying after them. They were about to catch up with them. So Saheku ordered Raymond to run faster. Otherwise, they would be doomed. These creatures were everywhere. Raymond didn't quite understand why they weren't destroying them, since they were powerful enough to deal with them. He wanted to ask Mr. So why they were running away. But So Saheku saw that there were hundreds of them here. He said that was exactly why they couldn't deal with them. They would be doomed. So Saheku kept looking around for a way out. There were only trees around. Everything looked the same. He realized that without a map, they couldn't make it. Ahead, among the trees, So Saheku saw a glow in the shape of a skull. His guess made his blood run cold. Grabbing Remy by the throat, he ordered him to follow him quickly. Remy found it difficult to breathe and demanded that So Saheku let him go. However, there was no time to argue. They were trapped by the numerous goblins. So Saheku tried to push Raymond into the last window that remained in this circle. Raymond felt that some force was pulling him upward, distancing him more and more from Master So. So Saheku remained deep inside the trap among the goblins. One of them came so close that in another moment he would grab him. Raymond watched this with horror and thought about how to help his master, but he ordered him to pull himself together and hide in the shelter, adding that this was not up for discussion. At the last moment, when he was no longer visible, Raymond heard from the depths of the trap that he should find him when everything settled down. A message appeared in the status window that So Saheku had entered a dungeon called the Cellar. So Saheku sank deeper and deeper into the dark, damp abyss with the goblins. He found himself at the bottom of some kind of pit, falling and hitting his head. So Saheku cursed Raymond, all because of that stupid elder. So Saheku got up and looked up. It was a huge cave dug by goblins, called the Cellar, and he had ended up right here. He thought that those creatures had lured him here like a complete idiot. He decided that they were probably going to kill him here, or maybe even eat him. So Saheku moved forward, with the determination that it was time to get out of here as soon as possible. He didn't want to waste any time. After all, the Holy Guardian was sitting in the neighboring village, and he had to deal with monster goblins. That wasn't part of his plan. He walked down the corridor, where it was too dark to see anything clearly. Suddenly, something lit up ahead, so Saheku decided to follow the light. He realized that storerooms were always lit up in the game if there was an entrance or exit nearby. He ran straight towards the light, which was getting closer and brighter. When he came out, he saw what he thought was just a huge empty room. He was dissatisfied with this outcome and thought that most of these rooms should be connected to each other. He looked around, and when his eyes adjusted to the darkness and the glow around him, he suddenly noticed someone moving at the far end of the room. He looked at the person and recognized her as a girl. He decided that she was probably just another adventurer like him. He took a couple of steps toward her, but then he heard the girl scream for him to stop and not come near her. Cold sweat broke out on So Saheku's body. He couldn't see who was in front of him, but he knew that the voice was familiar to him from somewhere. He rushed forward despite the girl's pleas, and began to ask her where she was from and who she was. She screamed even louder, that she didn't want him to come near her. It seemed as if she was even threatening him. And then he remembered that voice. It was familiar. In his memories, she told him that she would never leave him. He cried and told her that it was her promise. She swore to always be with him until the very end. Sitting in front of the gravestone of his beloved wife, So Sahuk cried. He kept asking why she had left him and left him alone. He stared at her portrait on the gravestone. Yenjae was the name of his wife, and now she appeared before him in this dungeon with her favorite book in her hands. So Saheku approached her and called her by name. The girl looked closely at the stranger. She clearly did not understand what he was saying, and Sosa-Heku immediately realized that he should not have called her name. A person who died 7 years ago couldn't be in the game. He forbade himself even to think about it. And then he heard the girl meekly reply that she had asked him not to approach her. He immediately understood what was happening. Turning around at the sound of a crash, he realized that they were not alone. Hundreds of goblins flew toward the light, straight at the two of them, squealing threats. Their eyes glowed in the darkness. They all rushed at Sosa-Heku at once, and the girl immediately jumped up from her seat, grabbed her book, and shouted for him to hold on. She said she would save the boy, and began to read something from the pages of her book. It was clearly her spellcasting skill. Everything was illuminated by a light like tongues of flame, and Sosa-Heku was able to see the girl and her appearance. He was shocked. He remembered how, before sending his daughter Soharu to kindergarten, he had decided to open an album and show her what her mother looked like. The little girl looked at her mother's photo with attention and interest, and kept asking if it was really her. Sosa-Heku said yes. Even after 7 years, he still remembered all her facial features and her figure, and now he recognized her. It couldn't be, but it turned out that the girl with the book was his wife. She looked at him and asked if he was okay. Sosa-Heku looked lost and couldn't say a word. A little later, he replied that everything was fine. Then she began to shake and, leaning against the wall, said that her mana had run out at the wrong moment. Sosa-Heku thought to himself that it had been rash to use all his last strength to defend him from the goblins. They both looked up and realized that countless goblins were about to attack again and were ready to pounce. Their first target was Yeon-jae. They sensed her weakness and decided to attack her. So Sahuk stopped himself. He still couldn't understand who she was, and told himself that this wasn't his Yeon-jae. She was just a character in a game. He even decided to just run away, to save his own life. He didn't have time to worry about anyone else. He tried to collect his thoughts. And then he saw the goblins attack the girl. She moaned and screamed at Sosa-Hyuk that he should save himself. He clenched his teeth and fists. Her voice was so familiar. He remembered that night in the hospital, and the sound of the wheelchair wheels rolling down the corridors. She was lying on it while the doctors tried to save her life. So Sahuk didn't leave her side for a minute. The last thing he remembers is his wife reaching out to him with her trembling and exhausted hand. So Saheku burst into tears and begged her not to leave him. But for the girl, everything had already been decided. It was as if he had stepped out of that ward into complete darkness, and now he imagined himself with a sword in his hands. He suddenly realized that he couldn't allow himself to do that, to just leave her here to die. He couldn't lose her again. He decided not to stand idly by. So Saheku picked up the sword and stepped toward the goblins. The warning system announced that the sacred blade had roared. He activated the Risk Taker skill and the Hidden Berserk Mode skill. So Saheku swore to himself that he would not let her look at him like that, full of pain and despair. Not today. The system announced that the more stamina was spent, the faster the enemy would be defeated. Only 20 seconds were allotted for this, and the clock started ticking. So Saheku rushed at the goblins with his blade. With sharp movements of his hand, he destroyed the monsters of the dungeon one after another. No one kept score. Rivers of their blood flowed across the hall. In a couple of seconds, hundreds of their bodies lay on the stone floor. The seconds were counting down. A few seconds later, Saheku felt the enormous power and mana reserves he now possessed. He continued to fight. All he wanted now, as he defeated hundreds and hundreds of these goblins, was to save Yen-ji. The girl was already practically unconscious. She was in the clutches of one of these nasty monsters. So Saheku had 10 seconds left. He reached out his hand to her and shouted for her to grab his palm. The girl opened her eyes slightly, but still did not understand how to do it. She had almost no strength left, so Saheku did not give up. He shouted at her again to grab him. His palm reached out to her. There were 8 seconds left, and then she was finally able to reach his hand and grab his fingers. He squeezed the girl's hand tightly in his. There were 6 seconds left before his skills expired, so Saheku pulled the girl toward him, freeing her from the clutches of the goblin monsters. He hugged her tightly and picked her up. She went limp again and lost consciousness. There were less than 5 seconds left, so Saheku jumped up sharply. The warning system said that the risk taker had absorbed enough blood. There were 3 seconds left. Next came the information that the ultimate ability had also been unlocked. So Saheku had only one last blow and 1 last second left. They rushed upstairs with the girl. An explosion thundered, and all the goblins left in the hall behind them screamed in pain. So Saheku realized that he had come out of berserk mode. Blood began to pour from his mouth as well. He had given all his strength to activating this skill. His level of combat skill exceeded the capabilities of his body. As Saheku lost consciousness, he thought only that he was too pathetic. He didn't want to experience this again. A few seconds later, he was already unconscious. So Saheku did not know how much time had passed, or where they were. He only felt some drops on his face when he opened his eyes again. The girl was smiling at him. She asked how he was feeling and said she was glad he had woken up. So Saheku didn't understand what he was drinking, and she said it was distilled water. It was usually used in the study of magic, but she thought it wouldn't hurt him now. So Saheku wanted to get up, but she warned him that it would be better not to move yet. Heku decided to himself that he believed that skill permanently sucked all the blood out of the user's body. He was glad that he had killed all the goblins and saved the girl. She looked at him and said that she hadn't had time to properly introduce herself. The girl gave her name. It turned out that her name was Lena, and she was a mage in the game. She thanked Saheku for saving her life and asked his name. He sat silently, suffering from a headache and body aches, unable to understand what these cunning tricks in the game were. He replied that his name was Chief So. He decided it was best to tell the truth. The girl smiled. She looked him straight in the eye and asked if she could just call him Chief. So Saheku realized that she didn't know him and silently tried to get back on his feet. His body still didn't obey him well. The girl asked where he was going. He replied that they didn't know when the goblins would return, and that if she had recovered, it was time to leave. He said they had to get out of there, and added that he thought it would be a good idea to cooperate, at least until they got out of the dungeon. Lena replied that she would gladly go with him, and was just thinking about what to do next. They set off down the dark tunnel. So Saheku was also glad that they were going together. After walking a few hundred meters, the travelers heard strange sounds in the darkness. So Saheku opened his eyes, and saw that his full recovery would not happen anytime soon. He did not want any more fights. He believed that if it happened, there was a high probability that he would not be able to fight. He understood that if he had known his status in advance, it would have been better. Then he would not be so nervous now. But it wouldn't open. The system probably still thought he was a stranger. All he could do was hope for Lena. Her magic was strong enough. He thought he should check her status window just in case, and started loading the data. However, after a couple of minutes, the system gave the same error and said it was impossible. So Saheku was shocked. It was some code unknown to him during the development of the game. So Saheku thought he didn't know the reason why the window wasn't displaying. He knew for sure that the skill she used in that hall did not belong to the higher levels. However, he was unable to check her status. He never found out the reason. They both realized that they were no longer alone, and so Saheku drew his sword and took a fighting stance. He understood that the sounds were coming from far away. Lena heard it too. She asked Saheku about them. The girl was interested in where these strange sounds were coming from. She opened her book, asking what she should do. She thought about going in the opposite direction. So Saheku replied that they needed to find another way, and would have to check what was ahead after all. He asked Lena to throw a fireball into the darkness of the corridor, so as not to use up too much of her mana. The girl began to read the spell, but replied with a smile that he had apparently never seen a mage who did his job carelessly. Finishing the spell, she commanded the fireball to fly forward, and it rushed into the darkness. The ball flew through the dark corridors in a swift stream of fire, while the travelers watched to see what awaited them there. After a while, they realized that the ball had reached its limit and hit something. The brightness and dust made them both cough and shut their eyes. When they opened them, they were shocked by what they saw. Right in front of them was something frightening. They entered the dungeon boss's room, and standing above them, towering over them, was a monkey-like monster. The warning system informed them that the supreme goblin tomb raider, Vogurfan himself, had appeared before them. So Saheku and Lena stood and stared at him in silence. They didn't know what to do now. Danger was inevitable, as was a battle with him. So Saheku thought to himself that if they had ended up right in the boss's lair, then his map was probably much more confusing than he could have imagined. He even regretted creating such labyrinths himself. He told Lena that they shouldn't fight Vogurfan. He asked her to stay close to the wall. She was surprised and asked who this boss was. So Saheku knew who they had encountered. After all, he had created him in the game himself. Vogurfan appeared as a monster at the game design stage, as a result of a unanimous decision by all members of the planning team. All of them, including the leader Yu, decided that even players who did not pay for participation would be able to defeat the boss. And the volume and amount of donations would not matter in this case. They would use other tactics, such as tricks. Everyone liked this idea so much that they decided to charge users additional fees, because they would not be able to withstand the incredible power of the monster. Vogurfan is a goblin boss. In other words, Saheku, now standing in his room, knew that his difficulty level was high, and that the monster could only be harmed by deception. He thought to himself that engaging in open combat with the goblin boss would be tantamount to suicide. He didn't know what to do or how to act. and then he felt Lena pull him hard and painfully by the cheek. He cried out and looked at this girl, who was unknown to him until this maze, with surprise and question in his eyes. She said discontentedly that she didn't like him racking his brains alone, and asked him to share his thoughts about the fight with her. She added that they were actually a team, even if only a temporary one. They were obliged to help and rescue each other. These words were unexpected for Sosa Heku, and made him think about their meaning. Lena asked if she understood correctly that, being in the room with the boss, they couldn't just run away, and they didn't have enough strength and mana to strike a blow. Sosa Heku replied that this was true, and that they now had to use the hidden tricks of the dungeon to the maximum. Vogrfan's hobby was collecting weapons. He especially loved those with hidden abilities. They decided to use his collection to their advantage. Lena said that in that case, he might have the strongest sword in the world. With it, they could defeat the boss with a single blow. She pointed to one of the options, and said that it could very well be the one. From Sa, Heku learned that the sword was the very mirror blade. It was a weapon of special power that absorbed and reflected the enemy's strength. He replied to Lena that it was not a bad choice. However, it was useless against Vogrfan, as the probability of reflecting the blow was negligible. The sword was disposable and would break after the first attack. Then he suddenly looked again at all the options they had before them, and a good idea formed in his head. He thought about how, when creating this monster boss, they themselves had planned for at least 5 people to fight it. However, now there were only 2 of them here, him and Lena. The girl was offended again when she saw that Sosa Heku had withdrawn into himself once more. He continued to think and realized that there was a possibility that if the number of team members decreased, the boss's health would also decrease. He told Lena that he understood that the monster now had fewer health points than usual, but the sword's power was the same. The chance of reflecting the blow was low. However, since they had no other sensible ideas at the moment, they had to take advantage of this and take a risk. Lena agreed, and they developed a plan of action. The goblin decided to pounce on them and began his attack. The warning system announced that the battle with the supreme goblin Vogrfan had begun. So Sa Heku and Lena did not expect such a quick start. They thought there should have been at least a short briefing. The warning system warned that the boss's gaze was fixed on Sosa Heku. And then, 5 seconds later, the system notified the participants of the fight that the boss wanted to get something. It was none other than Sosa Heku's sacred blade. He shouted, calling the goblin a sword lover. He did not want to give up his new weapon, especially since he had worked so hard to obtain it. And then they saw another problem. Small goblins wanted to attack them again. Lena began to read her fire spells from the book. She shouted to Sosa Heku that she would do her best to cover him. He rushed straight to the place where the mirror blade was located. It was their only chance at the moment to defeat the goblin boss and finally get out of this dungeon. So Sosa Heku ran as fast as he could toward the blade and saw the boss, Vogrfan, following him with burning eyes. A few moments later, Sosa Heku managed to grab the coveted weapon with his hand. He turned around and saw the goblin boss right in front of him. He was waving his paws, and Sosa Heku thought with horror that if he managed to hit him, it would definitely be the end. He remembered that during the game's development, he and the team had decided that there would be no instant death prevention in the dungeon system. Sosa Heku couldn't leave this game so quickly. He looked at the goblin and shouted that he had the coveted sword in his hands. If he wanted it, he would have to try harder. He took out the sacred blade and threw it up towards the ceiling with a sharp movement. Vogrfan, not having had time to strike Sosa Heku, stood mesmerized, watching the sword fly. This was exactly what Sosa Heku wanted. He shouted at him to catch the sacred blade. At that very moment, the sword pierced the stone vault and remained there. The goblin boss did not take his eyes off his cherished goal. Like a girl in love, he looked at the blade with love and desire and could not move. His long tongue fell out of his mouth. While Vogrfan was anticipating a new sword in his collection, Sosa Heku, taking advantage of his immobility, decided that the moment had come. He wanted to quickly grab the mirror blade and strike the goblin boss while he had the chance. But then he realized that he couldn't find the sword among the pile of gold. He rummaged through it very quickly, and then, after a minute, the mirror blade was finally found. Lena shouted for Sosa Heku to be careful. He realized that he was in danger, and when he turned around sharply, he was struck by what he saw. He had barely touched the mirror blade when Vogrfan apparently sensed it and lunged at the thief. He swung at Sosa Heku to strike him with his blows. Knowing that there was nowhere to run, Sosa Heku held out the mirror blade. Sosa Heku took a fighting stance and shouted at the monkey that it could attack. Vogrfan was angry. However, he stood motionless, and then Sosa Heku broke out in a cold sweat. He decided that something terrible was about to happen. However, the notification system suddenly announced that Sosa Heku Vogrfan, who had taken possession of the sword, was satisfied, and they saw the goblin dancing with joy. The notification system told the participants that Vogerfan approved of the quality of the blade, and that his greed had increased. That's when everything changed. Pointing to Lena's magic spellbook, the system announced that the goblin boss wanted it for himself. He rushed straight towards the girl with quick, sharp steps. Lena stood stunned by what was happening and didn't know what to do. So Saheku did not understand why this goblin suddenly needed an ordinary spellbook. He decided that the goblin was collecting everything magical. He shouted at Lena to run away. He added that if any of them got hurt here, it would be the end for both of them. So Saheku himself suddenly realized that he couldn't let Vogerfan use his skills in this battle. He ran forward, and the warning system announced that Sosa Heku had received a spear of ice and snow. A wild battle plan was born in Sosa Heku's head. He was enveloped in the magic of the new blade and understood. He would be able to use its full power only if Vogerfan put all his efforts into killing them and Lena. So, Saheku, enveloped in the magical energy of the mirror blade and the spear of ice and snow, threw it at Vogerfan. The spear shattered against the goblin's skin, scattering into hundreds of ice shards. Lena ran away from the monster. The boss cried out in surprise and pain, and immediately turned with his weapon in his paws towards Sosa Heku. He shouted at Lena to run to him. The girl obeyed and rushed toward him. However, she did not understand what her boss So had in mind. She said that it might be easier to just give her Vogerfan his book. So Saheku yelled at Lena not to do that, and said he was sure they had another way out. He kept yelling at her to run to him faster, and she listened. A few seconds later, they were next to each other. He grabbed her in his arms and said it was great teamwork, then started to do his part of the plan. The notification system suddenly announced that Sosa Heku had used an emotion expression skill. It was a dance. More specifically, it was a teabag, a silly but excellent way to laugh at a defeated opponent. While still working at the company, Sosa Heku had encountered similar expressions of emotion more than once. They were all stars there sometimes. One day, he told his boss that it would be a great idea and that people would spend a lot of money on it. So Saheku then said that he had come up with a great system in the game using Tybe. The director did not approve of it at first, but Sosa Heku persistently pursued him, explaining that participants still use verbal insults during fights. He proposed creating a system of subscriptions that would filter users who had received many complaints from others. At first, as always, the manager Yu and his other colleagues strongly rejected this idea. However, after lengthy persuasion, he finally got approval, including for the provocative function through dance interaction. And now Sosa Heku decided to use it. He grabbed Lena in his arms and started that very dance. Vogerfan looked at the two, stunned by what was happening. However, a second later, his gaze changed to one of anger. The warning system announced that Vogerfan was enraged by their absurd behavior. He shouted and decided to attack these people. So Saheku let Lena go, and drawing his blade, said that after repelling the attack, they would use a special tactic. He instructed her to prepare. Lena had to create a powerful spell, and at his signal, direct it in that direction. The girl was about to say that it was not worth doing, and that it might be too dangerous. However, Sosa Heku was no longer listening to her, as the system announced that Vogerfan's anger had reached its limit. The boss growled. So Saheku ordered Lena to be ready, as the goblin would strike them very soon. The girl began to read a spell from her book, and after a moment, Vogerfan spat something green from his mouth. The energy bursting from his belly was so strong that Sosa Heku and Lena had a hard time. The system announced that the mirror blade was ready. It was recharged with its power, and the probability of a successful reflection was around 35%. So Saheku decided that this should be enough, since the probability of success for the Gotti game created by the neighboring department was always even lower. He hoped that Lena would succeed, and that they would be lucky. The warning system announced that the mirror blade was beginning to absorb Vogerfan's attack. The next second, Sosa Heku raised the mirror blade high above his head, jumped up to the ceiling, and swung it at the boss. He shouted to Lena that now was the time to send the striking power of her spells in his direction. The girl looked up in horror, but did not argue, and did as she was told. The fiery dragon of immense power flew towards Vogerfan and Sosa Heku. Anything could happen to them now. So Saheku knew that the technique he had failed to perfect was a collaborative one. The energy flow from Lena's spell enveloped his entire body and his weapon. In the game, if you don't take into account the possibility of merging two abilities, it was essentially a useless technique that was not a pity to get rid of. They now had a joint attack of a mage and a swordsman. Even in the game, it would be called a magic swordsman. And Sosa Heku knew what to do, and how to use it correctly. He prepared for the final battle. Vogurfan stuck out his long tongue and screamed. He was angry and waved his paws in all directions. Because of the stream of fire, he didn't quite understand where his enemy was. However, in a moment, Sosaheku was right in front of his snout. He wanted to deliver a crushing blow to the goblin, but things didn't go quite according to plan. Sosaheku and Lena saw that under the enormous force and energy, the mirror blade simply shattered. And now, with no weapon in his hands, Sosaheku was flying straight into the mouth of the enraged Vogurfan. It seemed like it was the end, but then a greenish ball appeared from the broken hilt of the mirror blade. The warning system announced that the mirror sword effect had been activated and was now in action. In the next minute, everything changed on the face of the goblin Vogurfan. He was struck by a blow of enormous force and power. It literally dissolved him into thin air, leaving only clouds of smoke and dust. The warning system announced that the supreme goblin Vogurfan had been defeated. Sosaheku crashed onto the stone floor. He lay there and thought to himself that he would never again make items in games with a random function. He and Lena managed to find their way out of the dungeon and were now standing at the edge of an unfamiliar forest. Lena looked around and began to shout joyfully that she was very happy to see such bright light. After all, they hadn't seen it in so long. So Heikuk was just happy that he had managed to keep his sacred sword for himself. Then they heard strange sounds, and both turned their heads in that direction. Through the treetops and bushes, a young priest named Riemann was already running toward them with cries of joy. He knew So's boss. Seeing him safe and sound, he tried to hug him, and said that he couldn't even imagine how worried he had been for him all this time. He added that he had been gone for an eternity, and Sosaheku only thought about how much he disliked it. Riemann said he wanted to go and rescue him, but then he saw a flash and was very glad that it turned out to be Sosaheku. He asked how he managed to eliminate the boss on his own. And then Riemann finally saw Lena and asked who she was. Sosaheku said he would explain everything to the priest on the way. He wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Otherwise, this place would haunt his nightmares for a long time. Lena just smiled. They went to the stable. There, at the table, Sosaheku told Riemann everything. Riemann asked if they had destroyed the boss with a joint attack. He thought it was amazing. Sosaheku said that it was true, but in his opinion, they had simply been lucky. Riemann asked if he was right in thinking that Lena was a mage, and that it was she who had helped Sosaheku in the battle with Vogurfan. He replied that this was true, calling Lena a very skilled mage. Lena added that it was Chief So who saved her life, and that she was happy to meet him. Riemann replied that he was a priest and a healer. He added that Chief So had also helped him greatly in his life. From the outside, it seemed that they liked each other. Lena smiled and laughed. Her words bothered Sosaheku. He hadn't saved her at all. Everything turned out to be the opposite in that room with the goblins. He remembered perfectly well her look calling him for help, and the words she had spoken. Finishing his piece of bread, Sosaheku thought that it would be more accurate to say that his life had been saved. Then Lena looked at him and said with a smile to Chief So that they would work well together. She asked if he would take her on the team. This question stumped Sosaheku. He looked silently and in surprise at this girl from his past life and did not know what to say. Then Riemann said that he was all for it, and that if Chief So himself recognized her abilities, then it was a done deal. So Sahuk silently finished his soup. He was still thinking about what role Lena played in his destiny in this game. He saw her smile and kindness, but the image of his deceased wife would not leave him alone. He looked at Lena as if she were Yeonju and couldn't help himself. He loved his wife so much and didn't want to let go of her image now. He put on a serious face and replied that Lena could join their team. However, he immediately added that there would be no salary. After a while, having had lunch and taken horses for their cart, the three of them were already standing and getting ready to hit the road. Lena successfully joined the team. Heku sat with her behind the wagon and warned Raymond not to dare take a wrong turn again. He apologized and said that he had been berating himself every minute since then, and that it was the signs he had been following that were to blame. So Saheku began to say that he had no idea how much had happened to him yesterday. He could have turned into an old man without any stamina. Lena just giggled, sitting opposite, and Sosaheku asked her why she was laughing. She replied that the two of them were so friendly, and it was nice to see. Sosaheku replied that maybe that was true. But when Raymond heard this, he argued that anyone who knew them would say that So was terrorizing. Lena said that until now, She had always traveled alone, so these cute arguments were new to her. So Saheku looked at the girl silently. Then he decided to find out everything from her, and said that he had some questions for her. Since she was now officially a member of their team, one thing bothered him. Lena asked what he wanted to know. So Saheku asked the girl where she was from, and what her goals were here. He said that there was no particular difference in their classes. However, it was very strange that her status window was not displayed. He could not load and check her data. He looked intently at Lena and asked seriously where she came from and how she ended up here. The girl sighed and replied that she thought he would ask her about it someday. She looked a little downcast. She added that she actually wanted to be honest with them. She didn't remember where her hometown was, and she couldn't see her window herself. She said she could only guess, and that maybe someone had put a curse on her. Saheku was shocked by this revelation. The girl looked at him sadly and said that she only had fragmentary memories. However, these were just random moments from her childhood. Her goal was to meet the so-called mammon. So Saheku asked her again what she was talking about and who she was referring to. It seemed suspicious to him. Lena replied that someone had stolen her memories, and for some reason, she felt that she would only get them back when she met the mammon. She added that at first, she wanted to join other teams, but no one would trust a person with memory lapses. So Saheku listened to her carefully and looked at the girl with great suspicion. She was probably telling the truth. Then Remen interrupted their conversation and told Lena that she had the same goal as So's boss. The girl was very surprised and asked the young priest what he meant. He replied that So Saheku had also told him earlier that he needed to find Mammon in order to return home as soon as possible. Lena was very surprised and looked closely at So Saheku sitting right in front of her. She asked him if it was true that he was looking for the same person as her. So Saheku replied that it was. He smiled and added with some anger in his voice that he wanted to find and catch this bad man as soon as possible. He told Lena that since she also needed to meet him, she could rest assured that they would not kick her out of their team. The carriage moved forward. So Saheku sat and thought about everything. Suddenly, memories from his distant past flooded back to him. He remembered everything as if it were yesterday. How the teacher greeted everyone in the class, saying that he was the best among them all. He emphasized that this was not a place to look for a significant other. It was a volunteer class. The teacher suggested that they split into pairs of boys and girls, and if that didn't work out, then regardless of gender. So Saheku was scared. What other pairs? He thought he had come to a regular civics class. He was very young and very nervous at the time. After all, he had never spoken to a girl in his life, but he understood that he couldn't ignore these lessons. He couldn't figure out what to do. He looked around and decided that he was lucky and that there might still be some boys left. Then his attention was drawn to the click of heels and a soft voice. A pretty girl approached him, although at that moment he wasn't thinking about anything like that. His insecurity prevented him from being more relaxed. The girl apologized and asked permission to sit next to him. It was Yeonju. Now, sitting in the carriage, So Saheku pushed these memories away. He felt lousy. What was he thinking about? Yeonju was long gone. He couldn't get the thought out of his head that he was in a game he had created himself. He looked at Lena, who was sitting with him in the carriage, and looked exactly like his deceased wife. He convinced himself that he wasn't the kind of person who would mistake absurd things for coincidences. His task was to become stronger than he was now. He had to find the culprit who was doing this to him. He wondered if he could really return to real life. The only way to find out was to make it to the end. Lost in thought, he didn't notice when they reached the village of Coward. Raymond warned that horse-drawn carriages were prohibited in Coward, and suggested leaving it in the courtyard of the nearest hotel. Lena suggested that they all go to the inn together. Hearing this, Raymond asked if she wanted to rest after the long journey. Lena smiled and said that she was not tired, but her luggage was so full that she was even considering selling some of it. Meanwhile, So Saheku looked around. There was a guard standing at the gate. He headed straight for him, although he did not expect to see guards in the village. Heku thought to himself that such protection of the village was probably a common concept in the game. The guard stopped him and said that it was the first time he had seen a man. He asked what the stranger wanted here, so Saheku replied that he was here to find someone. The guard reached out his hand to So Saheku, preventing him from approaching with this gesture, and told him to go back. Outsiders were not allowed to enter. So Saheku was indignant that he had come such a long way for nothing. He did not like small talk. He had come here to find one person. The guard was unyielding. He said sternly that he would not repeat himself and asked him to leave. So Saheku could not accept the refusal. Since he had come to this world, nothing had worked out the way it should have. He had rushed here without stopping to rest. He had slept only 2 hours in the cart. His only food was a piece of bread that he had dipped in stew, and that was all. All this was driving him crazy, but he knew how to turn the situation to his advantage. When he was with the goblin, he took several gold bars. He took them out, confident that they would have an effect on the guard. He offered the guard to take as much as he needed, but that only angered him. With a cry of discontent, he almost attacked him. So Saheku still did not give up. He asked him to drop all formalities and take the gold coins. He saw through his visor how the guard's gaze changed at these words. He thought that it was the sight of the gold coins that had made such an impression on him, but he was wrong. A second later, the guard let out a furious cry that he would not repeat himself twice, and rushed at So Sahuk with his fists and weapon. He shouted at the stranger that he dared not bribe the guard. He had broken the rules of the holy village. Grabbing So Sahuk by the throat, the guard added that he was arresting him in the act. So Saheku tried to break free, but the guard held him tightly, and a struggle ensued between them. The guard pushed him sharply, and he fell to the ground. But So Saheku did not give up, and rushed at the guard again. In this struggle, after a counterattack from So, the guard's visor flew off. But ignoring this, he continued the fight and swung with all his might, hitting So Sahuk so hard that he flew several meters to the side. Sitting on the ground, So Sahuk said disappointedly that this was obviously not a holy village if they beat a man who had come here as a guest, especially not in these difficult times, when other villages across the country had declared their participation in the war against Mammon. Recovering from his fall, he grabbed the guard by the chest and said that this was just a cowardly village that hadn't even sent an army. So Saheku asked what holiness the guard was talking about. The guard yelled at him that he knew nothing and should not speak that way. So Saheku was indignant that after such a reception, what else should he know? Their relationship became extremely tense. There was such tension between So Saheku and the guard that it seemed that in another second, everything around them would burst into flames, just from their lightning-fast glances. Then Raymond approached the village gate and realized that he could no longer remain on the sideline. Moreover, he recognized the guard, so he called out to them. They both turned at his voice. The guard's gaze fell on Remen. He knows him, thought So Saheku. The guard asked Remen what he was doing there. He hadn't heard from him, and now he saw him here. The guard still hadn't let go of So Saheku and was holding him by the collar. It seemed that these two had met at a slightly inopportune moment. Seeing all this, Raymond was worried about their meeting. He had imagined it differently. He told So Saheku that this was the holy guard, Neil Castellum. So's boss was shocked by this statement. Raymond's words only added fuel to the fire. Neil was angry that the elder was connected to this man. He came with him. So Saheku immediately realized that their situation had only become more complicated after Raymond's confession, and that now they would all have to pay the price. They all, including Lena, stood near the village gate, realizing that they would not be allowed to enter as guests. The guard Neil Castellum would not allow it. They were all arrested. A quarter of an hour later, all three were sitting in a locked dungeon. Raymond called Neil and asked him to let them out. He said that Heku was to blame. Upon hearing this, So Saheku began to yell that Raymond was a traitor and that he no longer dared to call himself a teammate. He was angry. Raymond replied that this was too much and that it was actually the boss, So, who had started the fight as soon as they arrived at the new location. Lena watched their argument and was touched by their friendship. They continued to argue while she stood aside. Then she suddenly giggled and, looking at So Saheku, said that he seemed very childish. He was so surprised that he didn't even have time to cover his mouth. He didn't expect her to say that about him and giggle. He said that this holy guardian, or whoever this guy was, had started it. He couldn't have imagined that he would end up at that gate. Riemann sighed. He said with even if he hadn't ended up there, offering a bribe to a guard was still a crime. So Saheku disagreed. He replied that there was no such thing as a guard who didn't like money, and that was a clear violation of the stereotype. To him, they were talking complete nonsense. They continued to argue when suddenly they saw Neil himself in front of their camera. Everyone fell silent and looked at him. Raymond said that they were to blame. Mr. Neil silently looked at the criminals and then began to unlock the bolts on their camera. He said in a serious tone that all three of them should leave. The elder of his village was summoning them. Raymond, Lena, and Sosa Heku looked at him in surprise and silently began to get up from the ground. After a while, all of them, accompanied by the guard Neil, were standing on the street right in front of the elder's house. He announced that the elder was there and asked them to come inside. They still did not know why the village elder had summoned them. Before entering the elder's house, the guard sternly warned Sosa Heku to be extremely careful in his words and actions. Sosa Heku already understood that it was better to remain silent. Together, they entered the elder's room. They were greeted by a woman who was far from young. She said she was glad to see them. It was the village elder, Coward Krina, and she pointed to the girl standing next to her and introduced her as Captain Keller. Raymond hadn't seen Elder Krina in a long time, so he was very happy to see her. So Saheku wanted to say something sarcastic, but Lena quickly shut him up. Raymond introduced them as travelers. Krina said she was very sorry that such respected guests had been put in prison. There had been a misunderstanding. She felt uncomfortable that they had been rude to the elder of the village of Sinif. Raymond assured her that it was no big deal. They had also made mistakes. He also added that, among other things, he was no longer the elder. Krina was surprised by this news. Raymond said that the Gustav family no longer needed to be tied to the village. After all, he had dealt with the dragon that was terrorizing the village. Everyone in the room looked puzzled and incredulous. The guard was most surprised of all, because he had helped him pass the exam and knew how weak he was. He didn't understand how this had happened. Mrs. Lena decided to clarify whether they had understood correctly that he was referring to the dragon on the volcano near the mountain in the village, that it was the dragon that all the village elders dreamed of. Raymond confirmed everything that had been said, and it was clear how pleased he was with himself because he had succeeded. Krina spoke highly of Raymond, and the ancestor of the village of Sinif had indeed given a great gift. It was a blessing that Raymond could now control mana. The guard finally spoke to Raymond, praising him and noting that he looked much better than he had at the training ground where they had met. Raymond assured him that he had succeeded thanks to Chief So, who had helped him greatly in that predicament. Elder Krina asked him what had brought him to their village. Adventurers usually head to the capital, where there is a lot of work. Raymond quickly replied that Chief So really wanted to meet Mr. Neil, and since he knew him, he went with him. So Saheku, overhearing Raymond's conversation with the elder, became alert. He was interested in what Neil would say about this now. Neil frowned questioningly at Raymond as he continued to drink his hot beverage. His face was now expressionless. He stopped drinking for a second and asked why So Saheku wanted to meet him. So Saheku looked up from his mug and thought that he clearly liked the fact that the guard got straight to the point. He turned to Neil and said that he was looking for a guard like him. And when Raymond told him how he had passed the test by defeating Hiller without mana, it was only because of his ability to understand monsters and give them orders that he immediately wanted to see him. He highly valued this skill and wanted to hire him as a tank for his team. So Saheku added that he had also heard that he wanted to get rid of Mammon, which was great because then they would have to do it together. Guard Neil put the mug on the table. Different thoughts overwhelmed his mind. He didn't know who this man in front of him was. So Saheku thought it was time to tell him about himself, how he saved the village of Sinif together with Raymond from the dragon. He defeated the boss in the goblin dungeon, how he had teamed up with Lena, whom he had met for the first time. All this gave him reason to believe that he was strong enough. Neil listened silently. So Saheku liked the conversation, which was going even better than he had expected. Thanks to Riemann, he would be able to hire a good tank. Neil said that despite this man's merits, none of this had anything to do with him. So Saheku almost choked when he heard this. Neil got up from the table, saying that this wasn't a talent show audition, and if he was done, he could leave. He added that he was getting tired of just listening to his stories, and that it was starting to annoy him. So Sahuk was angered by the guard's words about the talent show. He decided that Neil simply wasn't listening to him, so Sahuk could no longer tolerate the guard's insolent behavior. Besides, they hadn't gotten along from the very beginning. He jumped up from the table and lunged at him with his fist. Now he would see if he really lived up to his title of Holy Guard, or if he was a coward. Raymond and Lena stood aside, afraid to get involved in their argument, as they were very aggressive, calling each other names. Guard Neil became even more angry after Sosa Heku's words, when he called him a common village coward. Captain Keller intervened in their fight. She pulled them apart and shouted at them to stop fighting in front of the elder. Guard Neil did not want to calm down, because this guy despised their village and called them cowards, even though he knew nothing about them. Keller tried to calm him down, but he was adamant and angry. She understood that this meeting had not gone well. Neil looked at her and said that he did not want to follow this man and would never leave the village again. Turning around, he went to the exit and slammed the door, leaving their entire company behind. So Saheku was furious. How dare he slam the door in front of them like that? He asked Remen and Lena if they had ever seen such a man without any manners. Lena thought for a moment about how to respond and couldn't hold back. She looked seriously at Chief So and said sarcastically that the same applied to him, that he was just as rude as Neil. Standing opposite each other and locking eyes, They could have set everything around them on fire. Captain Keller called them to their senses. She said that they were in the elder's room. They bowed their heads in respect and began to ask her for forgiveness. Elder Keller, not at all embarrassed, assured them that everything was fine. She had seen this before in her life. She said that rumors that Neil had become a holy guardian had spread quickly, and this wasn't the first time Neil had behaved this way. Every year, famous explorers come here and ask him to come with them. However, Neil always refuses them and stays in the village. This story greatly surprised the travelers. Elder Keeler continued her story and said that she even asked him once to leave the village herself. But his will on this matter was always unshakable. She said she asked everyone to take his feelings into consideration. He is haunted by ghosts of the past. While he was at the training ground taking his class placement exam, monsters attacked the village. When he returned to the village, everything was destroyed. His pain was so intense that he fell to the ground and burst into bitter tears. The next moment, Neil saw that very monster. It was Olnate, who had destroyed everyone in the area at that time. The guard stood right in front of him. The monster was charging at him on horseback. They were alone. There was not a single living soul around. In another moment, he would clash with him in battle. Neil was so devastated by what he saw that he did not yet realize that the monster was already close. It is unknown how it would have ended, but at that moment, a bright light illuminated the area, and the sinister horseman disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. Elder Keller told everyone that Neil was still haunted by the ghosts of the past. Lena and Raymond asked the elder if they had understood correctly that Neil was possessed by a ghost. The elder assured them that she had expressed herself incorrectly. They might have misinterpreted her story about this guy. She changed the subject, drawing their attention to the fact that they must be tired from their journey and need to rest. Their meeting with the elder was over. Leaving her house, they went out into the yard. Ryman didn't like that Mr. Neil was so angry. He suggested to So Saheku that they look for another tank. So Saheku only wanted this guard. He had tremendous defensive skills. If they didn't hire Neil, the attack on the mammoth could already be considered a failure. Lena said she noticed that the elder also did not want to talk about this topic with them any further. She found this strange. She remembered that Neil had said they knew nothing. If they could find out what he was hiding, they might be able to find a way to change Neil's mind. So Haykuk thought hard about whether there could be anything else he didn't know. He had to try to remember the story he himself had written. In this world where he now found himself, there was a long wall separating east and west. Humanity had erected this wall for its own survival, a wall that blocked the monsters that constantly invaded. It was the final line of defense, and it had always been divided into 3 zones: north, central, and south. So Haykuk remembered this well. The lords of each zone defend the front line with the help of villages and their resources. The village of Coward was called upon by the Lord of the North to participate in the war, but they could not withstand the fierce battle and fled from the wall. That was how it was in his story. But the villagers failed to defend an important military post. Therefore, they are hated and rejected in the kingdom. That is why the village of Coward is called Cowards. So Haykuk was mad that he couldn't remember what else this village and the holy guard Neil were hiding. He decided that he had had enough of racking his brain. He didn't want to know anything. He just wanted to get Neil on his team as a tank. The mere thought that someone else might take this best tank drove him crazy. Lena stood there, thinking about something. Finally, one thought came to her mind. It was not time to give up yet. She said that they needed to gather information about Neil. Raymond agreed with Ms. Lena, but he did not know how they would achieve this. He didn't think the villagers would tell them about him so easily. They began to think about what to do. Lena kept looking for a way out and told them that hope dies last. Then she remembered Captain Keller and how she looked at Neil with such care. The girl was sure that something was wrong here. She decided that this woman would help them. Lena suggested asking Captain Keller about Neil. She hoped that she would share something with them. She recalled that during the reception, she had been casting concerned glances at Neil. If she really cared about him, she should tell them everything. Raymond watched the elder leave the house, waiting for Captain Keller. He saw her go out into the street and began signaling to Ms. Lena. They didn't really know what to do next. Lena asked Sosa Heku if he was ready. Sosa Heku looked at her indifferently. He asked what else they had planned. Raymond shouted that if they delayed, they would lose sight of Keller and would not be able to talk to her. Lena gave instructions on how Sosa Hook should behave. He was required to pretend that he needed help and be affectionate. At first, he decided that everyone wanted him to be tied up, so he would scream for help. So Sahuk hoped that this would be the first and last time he did something like this. It wasn't his style, but he had no choice. Raymond suggested that Ms. Lena go and ask her questions herself, but she objected, saying that Chief So was in charge of their team. He would also need social skills, so Sahuk felt like an idiot in their eyes, since they had assigned him such a role in this story. Lena told him to stop talking nonsense and start acting. With a cry, he improvised and fell to the ground, pretending to be a victim. His cry attracted Keller's attention. Turning around, she saw a man lying on the ground. Coming closer, she recognized him as Chief So. She asked if he was all right. She also asked why he was here and hadn't returned to the shelter. She was curious about what had happened to him. So Sahuk did not do well in playing his assigned role. After hesitating, he simply said Neil's name directly and told her to tell everything. This directness greatly alarmed Keller. Hearing Neil's name, she became worried about it. So Saheku completely forgot everything he had been trained to do under Lena's guidance. He forgot that he should only say nice thing, and always with a pleasant smile on his face. He tried to smile, and with that expression on his face, asked her to reveal all the information about Neil. Keller did not understand what had just happened. Her eyes widened. She wanted to know what was going on. Raymond and Lena stood where they were and sat down with their mouths wide open at what they had heard. They decided that their whole plan would now simply collapse. Lena decided that Sosa Heku was an idiot, and how could he not handle such nonsense? However, later that evening at home, Keller was already laughing. She still couldn't believe that their boss, So, was such an uninhibited and strange person. Ms. Lena approached Keller and apologized for their boss. She said she didn't know why their boss was like that. Raymond, too. Keller thought it was better to be as honest as their boss. So, then she added that Neil was very angry with them today. She said that deep down, she still hoped that he would listen to their proposal and leave the village. After thinking for a moment, she said that Elder Krina was a spiritualist and could see the souls of those who were no longer alive. Raymond had read something about this in a book and added that he had heard that just as they gained experience points by killing monsters, monsters also became stronger by consuming human souls. He had heard that some souls were so powerful that they could change a monster's class. Captain Keller knew this. It was true, and such souls were called hero souls. She decided to take them to the Elder so they could hear the whole story from her. The Elder had seen such a hero soul on the day Neil was born. In another village, this might have been a blessing, but for their village, which was always closest to the final line, it was nothing but tragedy and grief. A village where a hero's soul lives will always be trouble, and if it is captured by a monster outside the wall, it will bring disaster. The Elder told her that night that this could be the start of a major attack. He said that this child must never leave the village, and if he did, no one would be able to hide the hero's soul. Keller burst into tears when she heard this. She wanted so much for Neil to become a free adventurer. Tears streamed from the woman's eyes. She couldn't understand what this child had done wrong. The Elder said sadly that even though it was a curse, they couldn't put other children in danger. Reeming remembered that Neil had taken the class placement exam with. He asked how Neil had gotten to the training ground if he wasn't allowed to leave the village. Keller remembered that Neil had secretly left the village the day before the exam. She remembered that day well. She told him the story of how, even as a little boy, Neil had always dreamed of going on a journey. All the children played the usual games in the village, but Neil's dreams were always beyond the village walls. He endured and restrained himself for more than 10 years, and at some point, his patience probably ran out. Leaving the village to take the exam and improve his class, he thought it would open up new horizons and opportunities for him. He was a very skilled strategist. He was very happy with every victory. He could calculate everything in his battle. Raymond told everyone that they had caught Toisagaka during the exam thanks to Neil. It worked just as he had told the team members. All the participants were happy about this and suggested that Neil join their team. After all, as long as he was with them, they were invincible. Kneeling before the statue after the exam, he dreamed that he would finally be able to become an adventurer and find his path. And most importantly, the monsters would stop coming after him. He had dreamed of this since childhood. Neil imagined how he would get his class, and immediately after that, be able to go to the capital. He decided that as an adventurer, he would explore many new worlds. Then he raised his class, which was recorded in the message window with the entry, Awakening of the Holy Guardian class. He decided at that moment that regardless of whether it was the soul of a hero or something else, nothing would matter to him now. Raymond congratulated Neil on receiving the title of Holy Guardian. Neil was grateful to everyone who was with him because they followed him. He reached the desired class. He deserved it, and now everyone is talking about him. He was already the best defender, and now he has received the corresponding class. They stood in the square and rejoiced at the successful completion of the exam, when suddenly, Neil was the first to notice a pigeon in the sky. He was alarmed and did not understand why the village had sent a pigeon. The bird landed on his hand, holding an envelope in its beak. Neil realized that the village had already found out that he had secretly left it. Something tugged at his heart. He became anxious. All his dreams flew away in an unknown direction. He thought about his future with horror. He opened the envelope. There was a message for him in one word, recommending that he return immediately. Raymond remembered how pale Neil had turned when he saw the letter. He knew why he couldn't leave the village, but his dreams had overcome his reason. It was too much to bear, and he had always wanted to see what lay beyond his native village. Neil realized that he had to return to his village immediately. He sensed that something had happened, and he was right. Monsters led by Owen had attacked the village. He burned houses and destroyed the inhabitants. The monster was looking for him. He wanted his soul. Everyone else who got in his way was just a trifle. He devoured their souls like a hungry beast, but felt no satisfaction. He paused and burned all the land around him, but still did not find the one he was looking for. He roared furiously, continuing to destroy everything, and shouting that he wanted to see the one everyone was talking about. When Neil returned to the village, he did not recognize it. The outskirts were gone, and the bodies of the inhabitants lay everywhere on the ground. What had happened weighed heavily on Neil's heart. He looked closely at all the bodies, trying to find people he knew. Among the bodies lying on the ground, Neil saw his friend Fuse. He immediately ran up to him and lifted him off the ground. He was unconscious and badly injured. Neil asked him to wake up. He wanted to know what had happened here. Fuse opened his eyes slightly and said that there were monsters in the village. He kept repeating deliriously that Neil should not have left their village, over and over again. Neil wanted to explain to him the reason for his absence, but the terrible consequences prevented him from saying anything. He urged Fuse to get up because they had to go and quickly rescue the remaining people. But Fuse was weak. His family was no longer alive, and he no longer had a reason to fight for his life. Neil rushed forward alone, looking around the battlefield and thinking that this was the first time such an attack had occurred. But where were the troops who were in the village and knew all the monsters' attack patterns? They were nowhere to be seen. He thought that perhaps they too had been killed by the monsters. Everyone had died from the cruelty. In the middle of the battlefield, Neil heard a noise. Turning his head, Neil saw him, the very same monster on horseback. With one hand, it grabbed the warrior by the throat, who could no longer breathe from such a grip, and held him without letting go. Neil saw how the energy and soul of this warrior flowed into the monster, adding strength and abilities. He no longer needed him, and the monster knight simply threw him to the ground like useless trash. Neil shouted angrily that he now knew who had done this to their village. He began to curse him with angry words. The monster's gaze fell on Neil when he heard his voice. Neil found himself at the epicenter of his power and might. The ring of fire did not let him escape. Neil shouted that he would pay for everything he had done to their village. The knight looked at the young man and laughed contemptuously and mockingly. He was sure that this warrior would not be able to fight back. However, he was still curious to see what this guy was capable of, and a duel began between them. Blows and explosions thundered. A fierce battle ensued. And after a while, the unknown monster said, seeing how strong the guy was, that this body was special. Neil lay nearby, almost unconscious, when the knight rushed to him and said that he had finally found the soul of a hero. With his last ounce of strength, Neil managed to get to his feet and, parrying another attack from the knight with his shield, rushed away to take cover. The knight just laughed after him, saying that he couldn't allow himself to flee the battlefield like a cowardly rat. Neil turned around and held his shield in front of him. The unknown monster struck him with another strong and powerful blow. He was superior to Neil in skill and power. The boy struggled to hold back and repel his attacks. At one point, Neil fell to the ground again, losing his balance from the blow. He groaned in pain and wondered who was standing before him. It was definitely a monster. However, it spoke like a normal person. It was a type that no one had heard of before. Neil looked at the monster and decided that he was in trouble. He had rushed here so quickly that he hadn't even acquired the necessary skills for an enemy of this level. It was dangerous, and Neil realized that if this continued, he would not be able to defeat this unknown knight and would simply die like so many others today. The monster approached Neil and told him that the soul of a hero was interfering and trying to save everyone from his attacks. He called it a blessing of sorts. And immediately after these words, the monster raised his weapon high for a strike. He said that now he would take care of him. Neil couldn't move. He understood that he could die now and began to call on all the gods for help. And then it was as if they had heard him. A bright light appeared on the horizon. The monster looked in the direction of the flash, and in that very second, it was struck by an energy wave like blue lightning. It didn't understand what it was. It began to scream that it only had a little time left to achieve its goal. It seemed to be begging someone for mercy, but for it, this was the end. Neil, lying there, saw something engulf the monster. It was still screaming that it couldn't believe it, that it was losing the hero's soul just like that. It didn't want to admit it. its red gaze began to fade. Shouting that it was absurdly ridiculous and offensive, it disappeared along with the bright light that appeared on the horizon. Neil lay on the ground and didn't understand what had just happened. Everything seemed unreal and strange. After a while, he heard people's voices. They were looking for survivors. A woman asked Neil if he was all right. He was bleeding heavily. He needed bandages and medicine. She kept asking him what had just happened here. They saw the monster burn alive when Neil arrived. They all asked him how he managed to defeat the knight. Neil sat on the ground with his head bandaged and simply replied that he didn't know himself. He said he only saw the monster disappear, burning up in the sunlight shining through the clouds. The woman replied that it was probably Michael's grace. She couldn't find any other explanation for what had happened. She also told Neil that she had bad news for him. Hearing this, he went straight to his village. The scene before him was not a pleasant one. Everyone was depressed after the monster attack. There were many dead and wounded. Children ran up to Neil and told their brother that they were in trouble. The men in their village had ordered the children not to go home. They also told Neil that their mother had not left the house since it all began, for some reason. Neil looked down at his feet with horror in his eyes. The children kept asking him what had happened to their mother. Neil didn't know what to say. He looked down at his feet and saw a broken photograph of himself and the children. Everything was covered in blood. He understood everything, but he couldn't bring himself to tell them what had happened. He just silently hugged the girl and boy, telling them that everything would be okay. The woman told Reem and Heck that since then, Neil had considered himself responsible for everything that had happened to the village, and had stayed to protect it. She added that everyone understood that such a tragedy could not have been caused by one person alone. That monster was to blame for everything. Reem was shocked. He said that if such a powerful monster had invaded their village, they should have sent help. She replied that no one had been sent to them. She said that their village had been rejected. Saheku asked what that meant. He thought to himself that he didn't understand what kind of monster it was. He remembered how he had personally cut out these details of the game's plot, which he considered unnecessary. And there was something else. He turned to the woman and said that one thing in this whole story seemed very strange and suspicious to him. She looked at Sosa-Hoop. He said that the village of Coward had fled from the battles. He asked if she didn't think it would be unconscionable to expect help from the kingdom in such a case. These words greatly offended and even seemed to insult the woman. She began to shout in discontent. She told everyone present that this was not true at all. She said that these were false rumors. So Saheku was shocked by what he heard. He asked her what she meant by that. She burst into tears and told everyone that the Northern Lord Udia was to blame for all their troubles with the king. He was the one who falsely accused their village of fleeing. He was at the casino at the time. His people said that his work in Kanwasak was very successful. He donated several times more than the other lords. Now, acquiring a large territory was no longer a problem for them. Judas sat at the gaming table and replied that he could not have achieved such results without them. He thanked everyone present and drank wine from his glass. Suddenly, a man ran into the hall and began shouting to the Lord that they had a serious problem. One of the courtiers asked who dared to burst in like that without permission and shout at the Lord. The man fell to his knees and began to apologize. He said he was a guard from the village of Coward. They had discovered something wrong during their shift. He had rushed here immediately to report it. The Lord took another sip of wine from his glass and asked what terrible thing had happened. The man raised his head and, trying not to look the Lord in the eye, said that the northern part of the wall had fallen. The Lord choked on his wine when he heard this. He did not expect such bad news on a day when everyone was praising him. He asked what this meant, and whether Mammon's army had invaded their village because of this sudden incident. The man replied that this was not quite the case. He said that the guards had not seen any invasion by the enemy. Lord Udia began to tear at his hair, shouting that he did not understand how this was possible. The wall could not have collapsed for no reason. His aides said that this matter must be hushed up immediately. The laws of control were very strict. On the day the king found out about this, and that the Lord had failed to deal with it, disaster would befall him. The Lord could be beheaded immediately, not to mention that he would not be given the territories promised to him earlier. This infuriated Lord Yuri. He asked how many guards already knew about the shadow. The man replied that no one knew yet, only the night shift brigade. The Lord looked at the man and replied that this was very good. In the current situation, they had no choice but to destroy more parts of the wall. The Lord's statement surprised the guard. He asked Yuri what he meant. The materials for the walls could only be obtained from the capital by air. It had to be a special brick made in the Vatican. The Lord thought for a moment. He knew that in the end, if repairs were necessary, his poor management would be exposed. But if the wall collapsed during the capture of the monster from the north, that would be different. He shouted to everyone that a great battle had supposedly taken place here because of the monster. It had failed to overcome the resistance and fled to the sea. they arrived there. The Lord ordered them to leave as many traces of a fierce battle as possible near the wall, and to tell the other guards about it. But that was not all. A man approached him and said that the kingdom would ask why he himself had not called their army for help. He pretended not to understand what he was talking about. He replied that he had actually called the army. His colleague did not understand what he was talking about and was very surprised. Lord Judah simply replied that Coward was the closest village to the north, and that suited him fine. He declared that from that moment on, Coward would no longer obey his orders as Lord, and fled the battlefield. From that time on, the village became known as the Village of Cowards. Keller told this story to everyone, so Sahyo and the others listened attentively. So Sahyo decided to sum up, and said that it was because of the northern lord Udea that the village had been rejected by the kingdom. But they managed to defeat the monster that attacked the village. This story was about how to live a happy life with the help of holy powers or something else. And now they are seriously asking him to believe in it. So Sahyook did not believe in such things, just as he did not believe in the Bible. Keller understood So Sahyook's feeling. She said that one after another, events had occurred that were difficult for outsiders to believe. However, they did not sit idly by. They sent envoys to the kingdom several times to request an audience, but none of them returned alive. Lena guessed that this was a warning for them to remain silent. The Northern Lord turned out to be more powerful. Raymond couldn't believe that this man was really a lord. How could he treat people like that? Keller said that after that, they focused on protecting the village, because they could no longer trust the kingdom that had been deceived by such an obvious lie. Raymond suddenly asked what had happened to the monster. After talking to Neil, a search was conducted throughout the village, but they found no trace of him. He did not return for several years after that. Everyone thought he had fallen. Perhaps he had died after the first attack. Raymond asked her why Mr. Neil couldn't leave the village. So Saheku sat on the ground and tried to untangle this web of events. He didn't understand what was going on. Keller said that Neil was the only one who still believed that the monster was alive. It was already late at night, but they had not yet gone to bed. Lena realized that the damage to the village was much greater than they had thought. She turned to So Sahuk and asked what they planned to do next. So Sahuk's head was spinning from the overload of information. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him. He wanted to give up and move on to the next village. Raymond stood nervously to one side and finally turned to the chief. He knew very well that So Saheku hated wasting time and liked to do everything quickly. However, he wanted to help Neil. He felt that it would hurt his heart if they left him alone without help. Lena looked at him with sympathy. So Saheku was annoyed that Raymond was reacting this way to what was happening. A few pitiful stories, and he was ready to come to the rescue. He shouldn't have come here, but now there was no choice. So he ordered Raymond to ask someone and find Neil's house. Raymond's joy knew no bound. He threw himself into So Sahyuk's arms. So Sahyuk couldn't stand it. It would have been better without it. After asking the residents where Neil lived, they found his house. Neil was busy making a crossbow at the time. A knock on the door distracted him from his work. He wasn't expecting anyone and didn't know who would come to his house so late at night. He asked who was at the door, saying it was late. So Sahyuk answered, followed by Ryman and Lena. When Neil saw them, he slammed the door shut. The guard was angry with So Saheku, whose behavior had infuriated him. Ryman and Lena tried to calm him down. So Saheku was relentless. He shouted at Neil not to be upset about the recent altercation. In fact, he had come to apologize and ask for forgiveness. Neil thought for a moment and opened the door. He asked why they were making so much noise. He asked them to be quiet because he had 2 small children at home. He looked at the guests from behind the door. So Saheku's question caught Neil off guard. He asked directly about the monster Neil had seen. It was on a horse and holding a spear. If So Saheku was right, the monster was capable of destroying the remaining village, including the children who were now sleeping in his house. Neil immediately changed his behavior and asked them to come inside. He understood that such things were definitely not to be discussed on the porch. The house was very warm. A fire was burning in the hearth, and a kettle was warming on the grate. Neil tried to be hospitable. The guard made 2 mugs of tea and served them to Ryman and Lena. He ignored So Saheku with the refreshments. Neil had no intention of treating So Saheku any differently. Neil sat down at the table, ready to listen to him. They said they had decided to visit him after hearing the story from the villager. He didn't even have time to do anything to defend himself. So Saheku said that if he had been smarter, he would have told them himself. The name of the monster he saw was Olneit. He is one of Mammon's direct subordinates. Once he has a target, he will not rest until he achieves his goal. He craves it and becomes obsessed with it. Chief So added that he himself did not know why and how it suddenly disappeared during the first attack. He added that as long as Neil was alive, it would attack the village again and again. So Saheku knew this for sure. Neil did not know if he could believe So Saheku's word. He did not trust him and did not even try to hide it. So Sahuk understood his doubts about his word. He asked Neil what guarantee he had that All Night would not attack tomorrow. And he was right again. Because at that very moment, high in the mountains, All Night was holding a meeting with the other bosses. At the threshold of the kingdom, behind closed doors, stood a figure in white robes, resembling a hooded cloak. It was Mammon. He ordered All Night to come out. He added that he had decided to free him, but in exchange for a service. All Night had been imprisoned for many years. He had angered Mammon, who punished the monster for not bringing him the soul of a hero as a gift. However, he was given a chance. Neil sat by the fire in his house and asked Raymond if they could all trust this man's words. Raymond replied that when it came to monsters, Sosaheku was very knowledgeable and could definitely be trusted. Sosaheku added that his offer was the same as before. He once again invited Neil to join his team, and if there were any problems in the village, he promised that they would solve them together. He said that Neil had probably guessed about his abilities, and he did not hide them. Neil said that until Lord Udia betrayed them, he, like Chief So, told plausible and credible stories. He added that he would be very grateful if they helped him, but there was no way for him to leave the village. So Saheku wanted to say something sarcastic about this, but Lena covered his mouth with her hand in time, and only replied that she was very interested in one thing. She said she couldn't help but notice the box full of crossbows. She asked if Neil had made them himself. He replied that he had. These were weapons that even the villagers, who were not accustomed to battle, could use. He had made them in case of another battle. So Saheku broke free from Lena's grip and asked if Neil really thought they could defeat the enemy. He compared the weapons to toothpicks in the side. He added that even if they managed to eliminate All Night, he was not the only monster targeting the hero's soul. Neil was silent, lost in thought. Then, lowering his head, he said that he did not think so. He wanted to say something else to Sosaheku, but then the door to the room opened. Neil was called. Everyone present looked toward the door and saw two children standing there. They were his sister and brother. Surprised and frightened, they asked Neil who all these people in their house were. Neil tried to smile and reassured them that everything was fine, and that these people had just stopped by for a minute. He sent the children to bed. They left, and as soon as the door closed, he grabbed his head and sighed heavily. He said he was tired and wanted to gather his thoughts. Neil asked everyone to leave because it was already late, so Saheku looked at him with displeasure and got up from his seat. He was unable to persuade Neil. When he was already outside, he turned around and told Neil that while they were in a truce, he wanted to tell him something else. Neil stood silently at the doorstep. So Saheku turned around and told Neil Castelli that his enemy was ahead and a tank should not look back. Neil understood what he was trying to say, but just kept standing silently at the doorstep of his house. A little later, Sosaheku's screams could be heard in the hotel. He was furious after his conversation with Neil. He called the guy a blockhead and said he thought he could win with a crossbow. He said that if he was going to screw up his abilities like that, then he was out. So Saheku banged his head on the table and said it would be better if his powers went to him. Lena said she was just as upset as he was. However, she understood Neil to some extent. The mistake he made in the past cost his family their lives. His body and mind froze, most likely out of fear. Raymond added that since no one knew when All Night would attack again, he was probably worried about leaving the village again. Lena became sad. She said it hurt her heart. And then there was Fuse, whom they met on the road. The guy asked them to take Neil out of the village. He begged them. So Saheku held his hand and listened as Fuse tearfully begged them to take Neil away, who was stuck in the village because of the words he had said to him back then. Raymond added that it would be better for everyone if Neil were more open with people. So Saheku, lying on the table and lamenting, asked Raymond what he meant by open. He thought for a moment, then suddenly stood up and asked Raymond why he had decided to follow him. Raymond thought for a moment, and then replied that he simply believed in him because he had saved the village. Raymond remembered the feeling he had experienced then. He was ready to follow Mr. So anywhere. So Sahyuk asked Lena the same question. She replied that she had made up her mind because he had saved her life. The girl added that if it weren't for Chief So, she would now be food for goblins. These answers from his teammates encouraged So Sahyuk, and as always, a cunning plan regarding Neil was born in his head. He immediately put on his cloak and hastily prepared to leave their hotel room. Surprised, Remen and Lena tried to find out from Chief So where he was going. He only replied that he had a great idea in mind. Lena tried to find out the details, but nothing came of it. So Saheku was in too much of a hurry, and they only saw him running out the door. Then it dawned on Lena, and she started yelling at Rema that she couldn't believe it. It was too much. She yelled that they had to stop Sosahek immediately, otherwise he might do something to the village. Lena grabbed Remen, and they rushed after Sosahek, yelling at him that he was playing too cruel a game. There was clearly something wrong with him. At some point, They caught up with him while he was carrying out his plan for the village. Raymond tried to grab So's boss, but he yelled that he was just trying to set fire to the mountain behind the settlement. That was all. He said they had to bring the monsters down from the mountain to the village to save it. Raymond held him and yelled that he had truly lost his mind. He said that they had to help the village, and that no one in their right mind would want to expose the inhabitants to such danger from monsters. So Saheku shouted back that there was nothing to be done, and that he had to create the most dramatic conditions possible for his purposes. He added that he would save everyone anyway, and that there was no problem. Riemann replied that this could not be done, because the mountain was the habitat of mountain dogs. If they were angered, they could destroy the village with their pack. So Saheku promised in response that he would catch them all. He asked the two of them not to interfere with him. He wanted Neil to take the bait. Lena just watched and was surprised by this approach. So Saheku remembered the crossbows and All Night. He remembered that Neil could not be defeated by such means. He called him a narrow-minded man again and said that there was no other way with him. He asked Raymond to let him go. Raymond replied that he would let him go, but that he had to be vigilant. He only asked how they were going to put out the fire on the mountain afterwards, so Saheku didn't think about it. He turned around and asked Lena for help. She just replied that he was crazy, and that she had no such skill at all. She suddenly thought about it. Then she said she could smell something burning. At that moment, both she and Raymond realized that it was all in vain. So Saheku replied that he had everything under control. He added that he hadn't lost his mind at all. However, when they all turned around to look at the fire, they were stunned. Raymond peered into the darkness, and suddenly, everything changed. He told his boss that a bright light had just flashed in the village, so Saheku noticed it himself, as did Lena, and the three of them rushed out of the forest toward the village. They saw what looked like bright lightning bolts and streams of energy flying toward the village, so Saheku was clearly pleased with his strategy. He said he was right, as always, and watched the monster approaching the village walls. The attack began, and it was none other than All Night. He had returned and was already rapidly approaching. A little earlier, a meeting was held in the Kingdom of Darkness. All Night announced that he had learned that the dragon Friday had been killed in the village of Sinif. The second participant, who resembled a bull, said that this was to their advantage. The lizard had finally kicked the bucket, and it was about time. He asked whose hands had done it. The third participant replied that he had been defeated by Raymond Gustav, the young elder of the village of Sinif. They clearly did not expect this from the young man. Until then, he had been unable to put up a defensive barrier, but one blow that day turned Friday to dust. One after another, numerous formations were destroyed. Key monsters of the eastern camp were dying one after another. It was a familiar situation. All Night then asked everyone if they thought a hero had been born. Someone echoed him, saying that he hadn't been so angry in a long time. He asked to be sent west so that he could destroy everyone, including this hero. The bull laughed, and someone in a hood replied that he had already sent All Night to that village. The faceless creature replied that he was probably already bored there. After all, All Night had rushed off at full speed. He asked the man in white where exactly he had sent All Night. The man replied that he had sent him to the village of Coward. He was mysterious and pensive, and it seemed that he knew something. He pulled his hand in a white glove out from under his cloak and took out a feather. He said that he would watch everything. Through All Night's gaze, he would follow the hero. After the feather, he took a ball of soul energy in his hand and added that he would destroy everyone at the right moment. This was the monster's plan. Meanwhile, in the village, the bell rang, warning everyone of the danger. Magical lightning bolts and energy balls began to rain down on the streets. The people were in trouble again. They ran through the streets of the village to take cover, while the local army gathered on the wall. The eastern guard post had already been attacked. Everyone had to hurry to help and run there. Neil said goodbye to his brother and sister. The children were crying. He asked Ken if he understood everything Neil was telling him. He asked him to take care of his sister Corée. Neil ordered his family to follow the people to the shelters. The boy burst into tears and kept asking why his brother couldn't go with them. Neil only replied that they should hurry and be careful. The guard post shouted that the monster was approaching from the east. The commander ordered everyone to minimize the load on the front line and prepare the archers. They raised their arrows. All Night was already approaching the village walls on his horse. The archers fired their arrows at him on command. Hundreds of arrows flew straight at the monster. However, this had no effect. All Night only thought mockingly that these pathetic little people seriously believed that these arrows could stop him. He rode forward without stopping and began to draw his sword from its sheath. All Night prepared to attack. He said that they were all just conceited little people, and he rode forward, driven by passion and anger. He called out in his inner voice for the hero's soul to appear as soon as possible. He couldn't wait to deal with him and taste his power. With a sharp throw, Olnate was almost at the village walls in a second, destroying everything in his path. The guards who got in his way flew to the sides, moaning in pain. He smashed them by the hundreds. Keller stood next to Neil, and watching the scene unfold, said that in the end, he was right after all. She said that he had worked hard to make crossbows for everyone, but they had all left. They had never been used in battle. She added that it would be great if several people could fight together, side by side. Everyone had participated actively in the training earlier. Neil replied that there was nothing wrong with that. Among those people were people like Fuse, who had suffered greatly at the time. Therefore, escape was not a horror for them. Keller asked if the boss himself had escaped this time. Neil put his helmet on his head and, preparing for battle, replied that he was not wasting any time. He would have left long ago, but he didn't have the opportunity. Keller looked at Neil, and he held out his fist to her, and said that he was offering to defeat him together. He was talking about Olnate. Keller smiled at Neil and responded to his gesture with her own fist extended toward him. She said that they were a team, and that's how they would do it. So, Saheku, Raymond, and Lena were still in the mountains at that time. While his teammates were horrified by what was happening, he just shook his head. For him, everything turned out even better than he had expected. Raymond asked what Chief So meant by that. He sincerely did not understand what was so good about it. So Saheku replied that they would not come down from the mountain until Neil himself found them and asked for help. Lena looked at Chief So and shouted that he did not know what he was saying or doing. The village was in great danger, so Saheku asked her what was wrong. Didn't she realize that Neil was the kind of person who would not change his mind even in the face of death? Only when his duty to the village was fulfilled would he be able to follow them. Lena was shocked by what she heard. Riemann began to yell at Chief So that this was abnormal and immoral. After all, many people would die, and innocent people at that. So Saheku replied that he thought the two of them had become too conceited about the team. He told them that they were not heroes. He said that he had never said that he would not help all the residents. There was nothing wrong with him wanting to change the situation a little in his favor. Lena couldn't believe these words, and began to ask Chief So why he was saying this. She believed that they could persuade Neil without this. She didn't like his scheming. And so Sahyuk just looked at them wearily and replied that, as usual, she was wrong about everything. However, he believed that if they died helping every corner of this village out of a worthless sense of grace, it would be nonsense. He added that there was nothing wrong with using the moment to their advantage to get the maximum benefit compared to the risks. Lena suddenly asked if he had saved her then for some benefit of his own. She asked if it was true that he didn't care about the death of people who were useless to him. So Saheku was unhappy that the conversation had gone so deep and far. He said she was too rational, and then he stopped talking. The girl got very angry and saw no other way out but to simply punch Chief So. Lying on the ground, he just asked what that was all about. Lena leaned over to him and replied that there were things much more important than immediate gain. She ran away from them to save the villagers. So Saheku started yelling after Lena that she should stay with them. Chief So looked at Raymond, who was standing silently, and asked what the hell was going on. And then he saw his staff. So Saheku asked the elder where he got it, and he replied that he took it from his house to help Chief So. He started crying. Raymond continued and said that he never thought he would use the staff for other purposes. He hit So Saheku hard and ran after Lena. Chief So, lying on the ground with a huge bump on his head, kept thinking if those two had really run away from him. He became angry and grabbed the green grass. He shouted after them that they could now do whatever they wanted, and that as of today, they were both fired from the team, but no one answered him. At that moment, chaos reigned in the village. Ash and dust settled on the ground, revealing a terrible scene. There were many bodies on the ground, both dead and wounded. One of the guards tried to find those who could still move. They all had to run to the second guard post. It was already unsafe here, and one of the guards told the other that he shouldn't just stand there, but should move quickly to the second post. But the other guard was staring into the distance and couldn't say a word. The guard asked him what he was looking at so intently. He turned his head in that direction and froze at what he saw. It was terrifying and shocking. A huge crowd of angry skeleton monsters was rushing toward them. There were more than 1,000 of them. The guards trembled with fear. At the other end of the village, the general was asked how things were going. He was glad that Neil and Keller had arrived. He said that their entire battle strategy had proved ineffective and pointless. Olnate had thrown his spear just once, and already there were so many dead and wounded that it was beyond comprehension. After the first attack, they captured the first guard post. He sighed. The commander added that if the monsters took the second guard post, it would be the end. Neil asked if there had been no news from the Vatican or the capital yet. The commander replied that there were no reinforcements at the moment. He added that the kingdom's goal was to show those who disobeyed them and set an example for the other villages. The monsters were already climbing the wall of the post. The commander said that they had only one choice: to fight alone or die here today. The battle between the monsters and the guards began. It was bloody and brutal. Olnate, watching everything from the sidelines, thought that these people were scum, more like insects. He decided that they couldn't figure out Mammon's train of thought at all. He rushed forward to the village walls. Olnate did not understand what Mammon was waiting for. After all, they were the most important ones. He threw his spear again. The enormous force of his blow suddenly collided with a new flow of power and energy, and was repelled. Olnate did not understand what had happened, and just stood silently in bewilderment, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, when the dust cleared, a warrior in armor and with a shield in his hands appeared before his eyes. Olnate recognized him. He laughed ominously, and said he was glad that he was finally here. He had been waiting for the hero's soul to appear. Neil looked straight at the monster, and seemed ready to attack. So Saheku walked alone through the mountains, unhappy that Lena and Remen had left him. He said that these kids could, and knew how, to humiliate their boss. He decided that he seemed weak to them. A pack of dogs appeared before him. So Saheku ignored them, and only added that they resembled his subordinates. They always made him look like he was the embodiment of evil. He remembered how once at work, he had a big argument with his boss, Wu, about the plot of the game. He yelled at him that he didn't like it. He said he didn't want to just watch manager Wu do someone else's job. They were standing on the roof of the building near the smoking area. The manager asked why, so Saheku began to shake manager Wu by the shoulders. The manager said that it wasn't even the most difficult order. That made him angry. So Saheku replied that the manager was already busy with work in their team, but for some reason was still helping another team with his experience. He added that if something went wrong and the manager broke the schedule, no one would take responsibility for him. He decided that the manager wanted a promotion. He yelled at the manager, grabbing him by the collar, saying that the manager was doing work that was barely enough for one person. Then a man came onto the roof. He saw what was happening and was shocked. He said to the two of them in bewilderment that he had just come to relax and smoke a cigarette. But looking at the situation, he apologized and hurried away, leaving So Saheku with his boss on the roof of the building. So Saheku let go of the man's collar and suddenly asked what he was doing wrong and why the guy had run away so quickly. Manager Yu replied that just because something was wrong didn't mean everything was fine. He said that So Sahuk was being foolish about the manager. So Sahuk looked at Manager Yu with a questioning expression on his face. He really didn't understand. He said that even if the manager didn't meet his personal standards, he would still remain a member of the team with them until the end. He asked if Manager So was going to disband the entire team and start all over again every time something like this happened. Now So remembered that. He sighed heavily and decided he needed to calm down for starters. He had always thought it was much more effective to remove those who were not suitable, but Neil was different. He was an irreplaceable talent for the group, and they had very little time. So, Saheku thought that it was time for the poor guy to move on. He had to do something. He stepped towards the village, thinking that attentiveness and understanding were not his specialty. His goal had always been maximum efficiency and achieving the best results. He had lived his entire life this way, and now, when it came down to it, his final bet was aimed precisely at this tank mage and healer, right here, right now. And then, something changed abruptly. His body began to tremble. He saw his sacred blade light up. So Saheku didn't understand anything. The alert system announced that the sacred sword, Risk Taker, was responding to his determination. At that moment, Neil was already fighting his own battle with Olnate. The monster said he had never seen an insect so determined. He was sure that the guy would die soon. He said that he had been expecting something special from him ever since he saw the look in his eyes. Neil did not answer the monster, and only tried to repel all his endless attacks. Olnate pounced on Neil and said that he was still weak. He was even getting bored fighting him. Neil was weakening. Olnate asked discontentedly what the warrior had been doing all this time. He said that his heroic soul did not suit him at all. Neil was already almost unconscious, bleeding profusely. He understood that he could die right now. Olnate jumped towards Neil, who was sitting on the ground. He began to tell him, swinging his spear, that this time he would make sure the guy died. Neil was already preparing to use his last ounce of strength to get up and repel Olnate's attack, when suddenly everything around him was illuminated by a bright light. He raised his head, not understanding what was happening, and saw Lena. The girl had arrived in time to help, and was already using her magic spells from the book. She bought him time, and Remen was able to heal Neil. The notification system indicated that his strength, abilities, and mana were growing again. Raymond ran up to the guy and asked if he was okay. Lena also came closer. Neil was happy to see the two of them and asked if Sosa Heku himself had also come with them to help him. Lena paused for a moment and then replied that first they should think about how to survive the night and then ask about everything else. She asked how he thought they could defeat All Night and if there was any way to do so. And then, as soon as she mentioned him, the monster appeared right in front of them and asked how they planned to attack him. He was completely unharmed after Lena's attack. Olnate asked them all how they wanted to fight him. Lena couldn't believe her eyes. She thought to herself that her magical attack had not worked at all on Olnate. He looked straight into the girl's eyes and asked the mage who she was. Lena couldn't answer him. He looked at her again and said that her soul was completely empty. Lena didn't understand what that meant. She was scared. Then the moon appeared in the sky, and the girl suddenly felt sick. Neil and Raymond couldn't understand what was happening to her. They began to question her. Olnate simply added that it didn't matter to him. He added that today was the end for all of them. He looked closely at Lena and focused on her first. She was weaker than the others. Neil and Raymond stood next to the girl. Olnate shouted that he planned to destroy the entire village along with them. He swung his powerful sword in their direction, but Neil noticed it in time and raised his shield in a second. He understood that Olnate's attack would be very strong and tried to protect the others. And then he suddenly heard a man's voice telling Olnate that his laughter was already annoying him. Neil opened his eyes. He couldn't believe that Sosa Heku himself had appeared before him, weapon in hand, and was already rapidly attacking Olnate. Sosa Heku had noticed in advance where the monster's spear would fly, and threw himself in that direction with his whole body. He was able to withstand its tremendous power. Droplets of water appeared on the sacred blade. None of those present understood what was happening before their eyes. Sosa Heku fought Olnate like a hero. At one point, he literally hung in the air in front of his team, holding the sacred blade in his hand. He was completely enveloped in water. Neil, Riemann, and Lena watched Sosa Heku's appearance with surprise and delight. Riemann had hoped until the last moment that Chief So would come to them. 10 minutes earlier, the notification system had asked Sosa Heku if he wanted to help his comrades in trouble and save the village. Holding the glowing sacred blade in his hands, he replied that he agreed to go there and fight the monster. He asked why the further he went, the more new things appeared. He did not understand who had set these parameters in the game, and when. The notification system told him that the Sacred Blade Risk Taker was about to evolve, and he would gain new abilities. So Heikuk asked to wait at least a minute to figure everything out properly. But the blade began to glow even brighter. Chief So shouted that he sincerely did not understand what was happening to him and his weapon. And then he saw a new message from the system. It said that a hidden effect called Saber Mode had appeared in the blade. The attack speed was increased by 150%. In addition, the commander's fall skill meant that Sosa Heku would be able to anticipate and guess the enemy's actions with this weapon. The Deep Abyss skill also appeared, allowing the blade to absorb some of the damage when hit. The Waterfall skill redirected attacks, and the Water Slider skill was unlocked. However, there was one limitation to such powerful skills. Since the user lacked skill, because of this lack, the duration of all the blade's enhancements was limited to 5 minutes. The sword became an S-class weapon, and it was capable of further revealing its true form if it found a response from its owner. So Heiku held the sword in his hands, and looking at Olnate, he ordered him to fight him. He turned to his companions and asked them what the situation was. They had no time. He added that it was very urgent, and he needed to understand what they were dealing with. All three stood and looked at Sosa Heku. Neil began his report by saying that the soldiers were advancing towards the last outpost, and this monster had lured him here. He said he wanted to help the outpost fight the monsters, but his hands and feet were tied. If he left Olnai, he could use his power. The same power he had already used when he attacked the village the first time. So Saheku replied that they would have to destroy Olnate, and before the last outpost collapsed. He asked Lena if she could continue fighting. She didn't look very strong or healthy. However, the girl tried to pull herself together and replied that they could all rely on her. So Saheku said that would be great. She would definitely help them in their fight against the monsters. Then, Lena and Raymond noticed water droplets in the air. It was surprising. Raymond asked Chief So what it was. He only replied with the power of thought, that this ability allowed everyone to hear his command. The duration was short, so he would not be able to stay with them for long. Since Olnate was only vulnerable to physical damage, magic had to be used only against the ghost troops. So Saheku asked Lena and Raymond to use their mana wisely and control all their powers and strength. He asked the guys not to overdo it. They looked at Sosa Heku, and all three, including Neil, replied that they understood. They were ready for further battle with Olnate under the leadership of Chief So. Then the monster, noticing the glow of Sosa Heku's soul, suddenly said that it was truly an amazing sight. He added that he did not understand where this man came from, but he had never seen such a bright, burning soul before. Olnate also said that if he managed to destroy them all, he would finally restore his honor and regain Mammon's trust. In addition, he longed to regain the loyalty of other powerful monsters. He raised his weapon. He began to command his army of skeleton monsters from afar, who attacked another guard post. Olnate thirsted for blood and revenge. He shouted that he would destroy them all. The monsters rushed into battle. It was a nightmarish sight, and a grand battle between humans and an army of monsters. Then Neil swung his powerful fists and launched an attack called a glove strike. He decided to help the outpost in the battle against the skeleton. They flew in different directions from his blows. Neil was a very strong warrior. He asked if there really was a strategy to defeat Olnate, because if they wasted all their strength here, it would be a disaster. Neil understood that then everything would really come to an end. However, Sosa Heku, striking the army of monsters, only mentally replied that there was. He added that he had actually said earlier that their mage could be relied upon. Lena had already begun to read her spell, and the warning system announced that the mage's skill, Focused Fire Attack, had been activated. Seeing his soldiers burning, Olnate declared that despite being an empty shell, this mage had certain talents. He ran straight into the attack and saw Sosa Heku flying towards him with a sacred blade in his hand. Olnate wanted to deal with them all as quickly as possible and went on the offensive. Sosa Heku told him to stop staring at their mage. He was angry at the monster and wanted to anger him too and divert his attention to himself. He succeeded, and Olnate rushed at him. He yelled at Sosa Heku to shut up and hit him hard. Chief So jumped aside and hit the wall. He sat there and said that it seemed like madness. How far can a person be thrown? He experienced Olnate's powerful attacks and thought that they would not be able to defeat him. He understood that he was very good at close combat. So Saheku also realized that magic had no effect on this powerful monster, and immediately thought that he didn't understand who had invented it. Chief So barely held on to the last outpost, and, looking around, saw the villagers still fighting off the monsters. He decided that, despite everything, the people were holding up well, which was unexpected for him. And then he saw a woman on top of the wall. She was shouting something at him. So Saheku did not recognize her at first, but he heard her shout to Chief So to take something. So Saheku realized that it was Keller. She threw a shield down to him from above, and shouted that she had seen Neil's shield break in battle with Olnate from the wall. She asked Chief So to give the shield to Neil. So Saheku grabbed it and heard something else. Keller said that he should also show Neil how beautiful and interesting it was outside the village. She smiled at him. So Saheku thought that Neil had survived all these hardships for a reason. He ran to him with the shield. On the way, he saw many skeletons burned by Lena's spell. The girl had done a great job. However, Riemann, who was standing next to her, saw how weak Lena was. It seemed that she had spent all her mana on this battle. Raymond kept asking if she was okay. At that moment, Olnate struck Neil hard. He fell to the ground. The monster looked at the hero and just smiled. He understood that everyone was weaker than him. Then the warning system indicated to Lena that Olnate was targeting her. He wanted to remove the mage from his path. The next message from the security system was that Olnate was activating his skill called Destructive Duel. Lena understood that she would most likely not survive his direct attacks. Neil saw that Olnate was trying to attack Riemann and Lena. He thought that if he at least had his shield, he could stop him. And then he heard a voice. It was Sosa Heku running up to Neil and telling him with his mind that he had something for the hero. Neil turned around, and Chief So threw the shield passed on from Keller's wall at him. Neil grabbed it and greeted Sosa Heku. Looking at Neil, he added mentally that his friend Keller had given it to him. Neil smiled. Now he had a chance. He immediately used his shield flash skill without delay. A bright light illuminated everything around him. Olnate did not expect such resistance from these people, and wondered where the light was coming from. Then he saw Neil. He raised the shield Keller had given him, and distracted the monster from attacking Lena and Rema. So Saheku noticed that Neil had managed to attract Olnate's attention, and that it was this guy who had protected the mage who was his target. He had heard earlier that he had helped Riemann fight the boss, and it seemed to be true. It was a mockery of the sword, this light emanating from the shield. It was the power of Michael, the creator god of this world. It was a unique attribute of the Holy Guard, and Neil differed from ordinary tanks in this respect. A noble spirit who was the first to enter the battlefield and sacrificed himself for his comrades. That was who Neil really was. And since Michael supported and blessed nobility, the special tanks were given the name Holy Guards. With Saheku, he saw that Neil had suddenly learned to use the power of light. even though he was not a religious person. He understood that this was a stunning sight and skill from the monster's point of view, and it was the best way to attract their attention. He jumped up to Neil and shouted at him to hold his shield, so that together they could reduce Olnate's health during the attack. He ran closer and held out his sacred blade before attacking the monster. Neil continued to hold Olnate's attention with the glow from his shield, while Sosa Heku delivered his powerful blow. The attack was effective, and they all saw the monster's strength and health halve. He roared in pain and rage, and in the next second, he jerked back and delivered his counterattack on Neil. Sosa Heku saw everything and was stunned by it. He realized that Neil was in even greater danger than he had initially thought. He was barely holding back Olnate's power. His health was at 30%, and Sosa Heku didn't understand one thing. Why did Neil have such health? Raymond was supposed to control everyone and heal them in time. He mentally called on Raymond to answer what was happening and why he wasn't treating him. Raymond replied that he had another problem nearby and was simply confused. Lena was in very bad shape, but she didn't want to give up. She took Raymond by the shoulder and said that by making raids, the tank had to buy time for everyone. That was why she didn't need healing right now. She told Raymond that this was a crucial moment, and it wasn't working for her. He listened carefully and didn't know how to leave her in that state, but he understood. Lena convinced him once again that she would be fine. Raymond agreed and began to use his shining healing tactic on Neil. Neil suddenly felt his body become lighter and his wounds heal. Raymond had truly grown in his abilities. Everyone could see it. So Haekuk also noticed how quickly Neil's health was improving, thanks to Raymond's healing, and couldn't understand if it was all because of that old man. Their battle with the main monster continued. Olnate set out to take Neil out of action, and threw him sharply to one side. He looked at them and said that they had no chance in a fight with him. He was the strongest monster. Olnate declared that no one could defeat him, either now or in the future. He mocked all these attempts. He added that soon he would clearly show everyone what he could do. Even insects stick together, but they are still small bugs. So Saheku saw how Olnate used some powerful technique in his strike. He even had to cover his eyes with his hand from the bright light. When he decided to check the monster's health and strength levels again, everything finally loaded. The data was visible. So Saheku now knew that the battle was entering its second phase. He decided that the guys had lost a little in this fight. However, Chief So decided that now it was a race against time, and if everything dragged on, they would all be destroyed. It was time to act. He removed the block from his blade, and the warning system said that the time for special skills to take effect was almost up. So Saheku stood in horror, with his sword in his hands, thinking only that he had not even properly instructed his colleagues before the second phase. And then Olnate created a kind of magic ball in his hands, and saying that they were all insignificant creatures, began to act. He was angry that these people had forced him to waste the soul he wanted to bring as a gift to Lord Mammon for new strength and health. He crushed it in his palm, and gaining strength, said that now they could not hope for a quick and easy death. So Saheku and the rest of his team saw what it was. Olnate tested his soul-devouring skill, drinking its essence to the dregs. It was one of Olnate's most impressive skills. It transformed him into a terrifying state, increasing his attack power by 200%. This was precisely why he had sacrificed the soul he had previously captured. So Saheku stood with his weapon in his hand and looked at the monster. He was the only one here who knew that the essence of this monster's skill was something else. He suddenly realized that Nyla was nowhere to be found, and called out to him. He urgently needed to find the hero. He ran through the village and called out to him. Mr. So himself thought only that he could not allow him to die here now. On the way to the village, crowds of lifeless bodies lay on the outskirts, their souls torn from their chests. So Saheku knew that in these circumstances, the worst memories that were close to the heart came back to life. Olnate demonstrated his power and cruelty, and tested people's psychological endurance. So Saheku knew one thing. In all this chaos, it was necessary to develop a plan. Riemann and Lena were standing by the building when they suddenly realized that they had appeared out of nowhere. Lena began to touch the stone walls around them and said she didn't understand anything. A minute ago, there were ruins here, and now the buildings had appeared on their own. She correctly assumed that this was also a special skill of Olnate. Then they heard footsteps and turned sharply in that direction. The villagers were walking straight towards them, as if trying to attack. They looked strange. Their eyes burned like zombies. Lena prepared to fight back. She had already cast her fire spell, Riemann was panicking, but he also understood everything. A minute later, they had already struck several strange people who were attacking them. Lena did not hesitate, but Raymond, on the contrary, constantly tried to calm her down and stop her. He still thought that these were normal villagers, but that was not the case at all. A minute later, the skeletons appeared in place of the people Lena had eliminated. Raymond understood everything now. These were the soldiers who had fled here. The warning system announced that these soldiers had died, and that 2 out of 170 had perished. If these monsters were not completely eliminated, Olnate's strength and power would remain, and he would remain invincible. Lena and Riemini stood and looked at the bodies. They still couldn't believe it. Olnate disguised his soldiers as real villagers. He did it on purpose. After all, no one would attack a person they knew or cared about. It was cowardly and cruel. They understood that now it would be difficult for Nilu and Sohek. It would be harder for them to deal with Olnate because of this. The village was overrun with the monster's soldiers. Lena decided to take on these soldiers together with Riemini. They rushed forward in search of these skeletons. They had to eliminate another 168 soldiers. Lena asked Riemini if Neil would be okay if they went too far and he couldn't heal him. At the same time, Neil stood on the battlefield with a weapon and shield in his hand. His gaze was fixed on the ground. The same photo was lying there again. The photo showed his entire family. He looked ahead and saw, as before, the ruins of the village after Olnate's attack. Rivers of blood flowed across the ground again, and the words of his mother, who kept asking what would happen if Neil did not return to the village, began to resurface in his mind. Her voice kept repeating that she was probably a bad mother. She always blamed herself for everything. And then Olnate laughed. He asked the hero what it was like to feel and hear this over and over again. He mocked Neil, like he was a poor little boy. The boy stood with his head bowed, and didn't even realize that this was an elaborate illusion created by the monster. The monster asked him how he could hear his mother's words. In his opinion, they were the last words she had spoken in her life. After all, she had died then. Neil completely lost his composure because of this, and rushed straight at Olnate with cries of rage. And that was exactly what Olnate was waiting for. He parried Neil's lightning-fast attack, and in the next minute, struck him with his powerful lightning bolt. The blow was devastating. Neil fell to the ground. Olnate just laughed and kept saying that people were really boring. The monster approached and stood directly over Neil's body. He looked down at him and said that there was only one thing he still regretted. He said he regretted not finishing the guy off last time. He was about to wish him well and swing his spear. But then Sosaheku suddenly appeared and stopped him. He arrived just in time and saved Neil's life. He kept asking who this Olnate was. Chief So declared, striking the monster blow after blow, that he had no right to destroy heroes in this village or anywhere else. Olnate, who looked like a huge centaur, turned around and looked at Sosaheku, telling him that the guy had a good punch, but his strength had not diminished. Chief So could clearly see all his strength and health stats. They were high. He seemed invincible. But Sasaheku noticed one thing. Even in Olnate's current state, he could still distract him. At the moment, Neil was saved, and that was the main thing. All that remained was to develop a strategy. To deal with Olnate in a state of soul devastation, they would have to deal with his soldiers as well. Within a radius of 30 meters, they had all been turned into villagers. Their souls had been emptied and reversed. Olnate used his subordinates as a shield to buy time to activate his last skill in the area, Cry in the Night. So Saheku tried his best to use his blade to counter Olnate's attacks. He was at his limit, but all he could think about was that they shouldn't waste any more time. And in general, he thought it was his mistake. He was supposed to inform all team members about this before the buff wore off. He kept wondering why he was so bad at communication. Lena and Raymond did everything for him. He understood that she was very quick-witted, and most likely took on the job of dealing with the monster soldiers. But Sosaheku understood that her mana would most likely run out quickly. The same was true for Riemann's powers and abilities. Since he and Neil were out of reach because of the buildings, Riemann had to constantly activate his large-scale healing. It was difficult. Neil had received a practically decisive blow, and it happened because of his emotional turmoil. If this continued, Neil would end up in an abyss. It would be difficult to get him out of it. So Saheku started yelling at the guy. He tried to wake him up and shouted insults. He wanted him to wake up, saying that otherwise they would all die because of him. He began to urge him that a holy guardian is not the kind of person who falls because of something like that. Chief So yelled at him to wake up. He himself only had 34% health left. He thought that he simply had to save Neil. So Saheku knew that no matter what, this was the best choice for everyone, even if he himself did not agree with something. Time was running out, and Olnate's soldiers were advancing. There were still many of them. Lena also understood that if they continued in the same vein, everyone would be destroyed. Olnate had not yet had time to use his final skill, but there was little time left before that. Lena sensed someone behind her. She had to deal with all Night's soldiers quickly, and then she heard the sound of crossbows, so Saheku heard it too. He turned his head toward the outpost. The sounds were familiar to Nilu. He just didn't understand where they were coming from. He finally opened his eyes and returned to reality. The crossbow bolts quickly eliminated Olnate's soldiers. Lena turned around and suddenly saw Fuse. He told her that it wasn't over yet, and he had warriors with him. The warning system reported that more than 15 skeleton soldiers had already been killed. Lena recognized him, of course. She had met this man when they first arrived in the village that evening. He begged Saheku about Nile. He sobbed, saying that the hero was trapped in the village, and that it was all because of what he had said to him back then. He cried like a child because he blamed himself for Nile's current situation. He was wounded and broken. Lena was glad to see Fuse and the other fighters. She asked if all the villagers were supposed to evacuate. She wanted to know how they got there. Ryman stood nearby and listened intently. Fuse replied that Keller had brought everyone there. If it weren't for the shortcut that only they knew about, they wouldn't have been able to arrive in time to help. He told them that they should all go to Sosahek. He said that they should follow him, and he would accompany them. The warning system reported that more than 24 Olnay soldiers had already been killed. Fuse and his men were doing a great job. A little later, they had already killed more than 67 ghosts. Then 98 of them were killed. The crossbows that Neil had built for the villagers were now in their hands. Soon, they had eliminated about 154 Olnate soldiers. And then, finally, the warning system informed everyone that they had all been wiped out. All 170 of them. So Heku, fighting, could not understand what was happening. He realized that all the soldiers had been destroyed and decided that it was Lena. He had always believed that she could not use her magic outside the area, but he was glad that Olnate's soldiers had finally been destroyed and that he could still fight and had not died by this time. Although the buff was gone, the remnants of his skills were still present in his sacred blade. And then he heard the voice of the warning system. It announced that the main skill of those willing to take risks had been activated. The water slider was active, and so Saheku couldn't miss the chance to take advantage of it. He struck Olnate with a lightning-fast blow. Olnate was no longer invincible. He began to lose his strength and health levels. Keller was already running towards Neil, who was lying on the ground. He was still on the verge of reality and Olnate's delirium, but he couldn't get to his feet. When she helped him up, he asked her why the villagers had done this. He wanted to know what was going on. He asked her what had happened to the last outpost and to the captain. She looked at the hero silently and sadly. He asked again what had happened, and then Keller, with tears in her eyes, began her story. She said that the captain was no longer alive. He had done everything possible to save the outpost, but time was running out. He was only able to open the way. But the price of this act was his own life. The captain had no other choice. 15 minutes before everything happened, terrible events were unfolding at the second guard post. Skeleton monsters were climbing and climbing the wall. There were hundreds of them. At one point, Keller noticed a darkening in the sky and reported it to the captain. He looked up and saw it too. They understood what it meant. They had seen the exact same phenomenon on that day. That was when their village was first invaded. Shortly after something darkened the sky, there was a powerful explosion. That was when Neil saw it, as he bent over the wounded Fuse on the battlefield. By the time he arrived, many residents had already died. The captain told Keller that they could not allow themselves to witness such a catastrophe again. He ordered Keller to retreat with the remaining surviving soldiers. It seems that by that moment, a terrible but only possible plan had already formed in his mind. Keller begged the captain to reconsider and said that she did not want to abandon him under any circumstances. She shouted that she would stay and fight alongside him until the very end. But he replied that he had not told her to give up the fight. He said that she should give the crossbows he had made for Neil's future to the villagers. Thanks to the adventurers who had come in search of Neil, there would be no more skeleton soldiers as reinforcements. It was thanks to them that they had been able to hold out for so long. He added that they couldn't afford to miss this chance. It was a great opportunity to defeat the enemy, and now was the time to carry out the final operation. He handed her a piece of paper, saying that it contained the last mission. Keller cried. She took the message from the captain, realizing that she would most likely never see him again. A gong sounded, and the captain ordered the soldiers to leave their posts and retreat with Keller. The archers were to maintain their formation, and then also retreat from the walls. The skeleton soldiers continued to climb up. The captain informed everyone that this was their last operation. He ordered everyone to gather at the entrance to the village gate. Keller was already running to the shelter with the soldier. She said that all the residents who had trained with Neil had received crossbows. She cried uncontrollably, realizing what the captain was about to do. His last words to Keller were an appeal. He said he hoped she would be able to read his letter. Then he lit the fuse with his torch. The captain then said that this meant he had struck a blow against the men outside the walls. There was a loud explosion. He also said that when he saw Neil training every day and teaching the villagers how to shoot crossbows. He didn't believe in him. The captain thought the guy was stupid and naive, but now he understood that all hope rested on him. The wall collapsed. The captain had always thought that farmers who had never seen a battlefield understood nothing about fighting. Skeletons fell from the explosion down the wall. They were buried under the rubble. Despite the fact that the captain had strong soldiers who had survived the night battles, Neil still trained the residents. He did not rely solely on the army. And now, when the arrows of these very residents of the city began to hit the enemies and their targets, everything changed. The captain immediately realized that he was wrong in his opinion about this hero and his action. He changed his mind about him. Neil once told him that it takes more than specially trained professionals and soldiers to defend a village. Keller was already in the forest with them and began to call on the other residents to join them and fight for their land and their village. She told them about the goals of the latest operation and the sacrifice made by the captain. She sought support and help from the people. The people began to ponder her words and appeals. Keller was looking for volunteers. After all, the captain also hoped that everything would work out. He always said that they all had to fight together that time, as one. The village's last guard post was tall and sturdy. It would be difficult for any army to get through it. The captain believed that if they managed to push it forward and knock it over, it would become a powerful weapon. They could then easily crush the remnants of All Knight's skeleton soldiers with the help of the guards. He ordered all the warriors to move forward and not to hesitate. He believed that when someone like Sosa Heku came to the rescue, they had to make a decision, and it was necessary to quickly cross the front line they had been holding. At that moment, it was Fuse who was the first to raise his hand as a volunteer to fight the enemy, and all the villagers followed him. The captain believed that together, with their combined efforts, they would be able to defeat the enemy, because Neil had been working hard on it all along. He read all this in the letter the captain had given him. Keller was nearby. The captain's words and message deeply moved Neil. Keller told him that everyone who had come here had nothing left to lose. Some had lost their entire families that very night during the first attack. Some had lost an arm. Some even lost both legs. But that didn't stop people from believing that they could defeat the enemy. They decided to fight for their future. Keller said that the crossbows he made for everyone were wonderful because even those with physical difficulties could use them. Keller looked at the hero and held out her fist. She said that they should try again to do everything right. And together, Neil, with tears in his eyes, just smiled and held out his fist too. He understood that they were a team, and all the villagers were now with them in this battle. Now everyone had hope. And then, standing up, Neil suddenly felt a change in his body. He didn't understand what was happening. He felt his heart pounding. He bent over and tried to catch his breath. All he could think about was defeating All Knight. He didn't want the villagers to suffer again. So Saheku was still trying to fend off the monster's attacks. His strength was running out. He thought to himself that when everything was settled, he would like to reunite with his team and start communicating with them again. Lena and Raymond were also trying their best to fight off the enemy. Then, a bright light enveloped the hero Neil. He closed his eyes. The words that a tank should not turn in a circle with its back to the enemy came to his mind. He opened his eyes and saw a notification window. It said that the event had been triggered. The Holy Guard's insight now illuminated a bleak future. Everything had changed. The monster All Knight himself couldn't help but notice this bright light. He was distracted from his battle with Sosa Heku, and they both looked in that direction. At first, Chief So couldn't understand what the glow was. But then he began to guess. He decided that he had seen something like this when Reima awoke, and Sosa Heku decided that most likely, Nilu had also undergone such powerful changes. All Knight was angry, and just yelled at everyone that humans were worthless, just like this hero. He told Sosa Heku not to dare crawl under his feet anymore. His powerful blows reached their limits, and Chief So had to cover his ears with his hands from the wind and the monster's voice. All Knight began to say that humans were nothing more than weak, worthless creatures. He despised them all. He jumped up to Sosa Heku and told him that he deserved to be used as material for the Lord of Mammon. And then Sosa Heku noticed that All Knight had stuck his spear into the ground. This was bad. It was a move before he launched his final skill. So Saheku decided that there was still time, and that they should all just keep going and hold out a little longer. He didn't know how to block a skill that dealt thousands of damage. He understood that Neil, who had never left his village, didn't know how to do it either. The hero had only been outside the district once during his class awakening. He did not have the skills to damage such a large area. All Knight began to speak, calling for a dawn as black as darkness. He used his final skill, called Cry in the Night. So S.A. Heku understood that this was most likely the end. A huge bluish ball appeared above the ground, ready to explode and wipe them all out. So S.A. Heku was angry, and rushed towards All Knight with his last ounce of strength. He wanted to stop him somehow. All Knight began to say that resistance was futile. And then, in an instant, everything really changed. The black darkness in the sky was replaced by bright sunlight. Neil himself flew down from the air toward All Knight, shield in hand. He struck the monster hard. The shield shattered into pieces, but the monster suddenly groaned loudly. It felt the damage. Neil suddenly thanked everyone for waiting for him. He was now ready to do everything he could. So Saheku replied discontentedly that he could have come earlier, but he himself understood that this was how it was supposed to happen. And then Neil, continuing to attack All Knight, asked Saheku if he could ask him something. Helping him in his attacks on the enemy, Saheku replied that it was not quite the right situation. However, he was, of course, ready to do whatever Neil asked. Neil flew towards All Knight and said that all he wanted was to hear the real reason why Saheku himself was fighting the monster. So's boss didn't like this conversation and found it inappropriate given the critical situation. He reminded Neil of this. All Knight ordered the two of them to stop arguing. Their noisy chatter annoyed him. The monster was still more powerful and stronger than the two of them. They all knew that. However, All Knight was no longer invincible. He struck Saheku hard, leaving him with less than 1% of his life remaining. Neil saw how strong All Knight was and tried his best to resist his attacks. Lena came to their aid with her magic. Raymond also tried to heal the heroes. In addition, the villagers stood behind them. They all arrived in time to help. Just like Neil, Raymond immediately began to heal Saheku. He added thousands of health points to him. He was getting better and better. Neil felt the same way. He was also quite tired from fighting All Knight. So Saheku once again wondered why he was fighting. He saw that the monster was ready to use its final skill on them. And then he replied that he wanted to be honest, both with his colleagues and with himself. All these questions related to the conquest of Mammon, the question of world peace, and so on. These things did not concern him. He rushed back into battle with All Knight, seeing his strength and health dwindling. So Saheku thought about the question again. He knew the answer. He simply wanted to go home. All Knight snapped his fingers and used his final attack. An explosion thundered. So Saheku replied that he wanted to go home because his family was the only thing waiting for him there. And then something happened. Keller and the others didn't catch anything. The woman kept looking at her hand. Everyone asked her if it was true that they had just been attacked. No one understood why they were all alive. Everyone was asking the same question. Then Leah and Raymond looked up and were stunned by what they saw. So Saheku couldn't believe his eyes either. He had never seen anything like this before. Neil stood right in front of a sign that said, "Holy Reflection," had been used. The alert system said that this skill unconditionally protects all forms of life within the Allies' reach. Neil turned to everyone and clenched his powerful fist. He said that if you are the head of the family, then he also has this sign. He heard Saheku's words. He was still in shock from what he had seen on the ground in front of the window of the Holy Reflection. The system announced that Neil had voluntarily joined Saheku's group. He had become a member of his team. The SO chief replied with a smile that if the guy had such a skill, he should have mentioned it earlier. But Neil replied that he had only just learned this skill. It was the first time he had done something like this, and it seemed unfamiliar and new to him. He added that after meeting Keller, a notification appeared, and he confirmed it. The system notified Neil that he had received an ultimate skill called Holy Reflection. He had never seen it before, and of course, had never used it. He added to Chief So that they had little time left. He said they could move forward, and smiled broadly. He was ready to follow Saheku. The latter suddenly knelt on the ground, and bowed his head before Neil. It looked unusual, so Saheku knew that countless skills had been developed for each class in the game. The Holy Reflection skill could be acquired through enlightenment, or gained after patience or hardship. The acquisition model that allowed the player to obtain various skills depended on the accumulated experience. That was the idea. And it was proposed by the very same manager at Saheku named Wu. It was a complex and interesting skill design, but Wu's colleagues, whom he always helped at the company, helped him. In the end, they were all able to make the desired skills in this game possible. So Saheku had no idea it would turn out this way. He remembered telling him that he was probably joking and that it was impossible. He was angry, as usual. He added that he didn't know if this idea would help Manager Wu get a promotion, but he was doing all the work. He remembered arguing about this with Manager Wu on the roof of the building, saying that Manager Wu was doing enough work for one person. Now, Saheku understood that the things he had always looked down on and ignored had already saved his life twice. He rushed back into battle with All Knight, along with the others. He thought it was ironic. They struck the monster blow after blow, and it began to howl in pain. It was losing its strength and health. Neil also arrived in time, and while Sosa Heku attacked the monster from the side, he defended himself from its blows with shields in close combat. Sosa Heku was determined to win. He knew that his goal of recruiting the best tank to the team had come true. Now he had to free the village from the monster. He remembered how he had clashed with the managers at WU, and until his death at work, they could not find common ground. He struck Olnate again with these thoughts. Olnate groaned again, and S.A. Heku saw his strength and power diminish in anger. He thought about how the reason manager Wu took on everything was foolish. He took on other people's work, and the foolishness was that it was the only way for him to survive. They constantly argued with manager Wu about this, but in the end, the game development schedule was delayed. The director's position was shaken, and Sosa Hook himself was furious. He thought of Wu as a pathetic and irresponsible person. He considered him simply incompetent at work, and would never have thought that it was this manager who would help him. He always sat at work, and when he met him in the corridors of the company, he felt nothing but hatred for that man. But whether then or now, Sosa Heku believed he knew everything, and thought he would be right no matter what. He was pathetic and arrogant, and only now did he understand all this. They were again hit hard by Olnate. However, they were able to fight back. At one point, Sosa Heku fell to the ground, exhausted. He sighed and shouted at Neil to deliver his final blow. And the hero named Neil Gastellium, holding his sacred shield in his hand, rose into the air and delivered it. Olnate couldn't believe it. He shouted that this couldn't be happening, and that it was complete nonsense. He saw Neil's eyes burning with rage and power. Olnate understood that the end was coming for him. A powerful explosion thundered, illuminating everything around it with its light.